already know the wealth of benefits that a diverse and inclusive environment can bring in our businesses. We see increased innovation, more effective outcomes, and flourishing creativity and teamwork. Not only that, but it has been proven to be economically profitable for business.
So good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this 4th annual Conference of Powerful Women. I'm Ruth Kearney, I'm the chair of Powerful Women, and I'm delighted that more than 400 people have signed up for our event today from all over the UK, which is one of the benefits of holding this online for the 2nd year running. We've got a packed conference agenda full of inspiring speakers, new ideas, and I hope some challenging debate, which is all around today's theme, or this year's theme, which is securing the diversity and inclusion we need for net zero, how to bring gender commitments to life. So with this conference coming just a few weeks after COP26 and all the climate talks, we want to look at about how we can put diversity and inclusion at the heart of building a net zero workforce so that we can meet the energy challenges ahead. And we'll be focusing especially on the tangible actions that companies, government and regulators need to be taking to step up action and deliver on their commitments to increase the representation of women in the industry, and also to improve inclusion and diversity of all kinds. This year, we've divided the conference into 2 parts. So today, this morning, is a high-level plenary session. It's open to everyone. And we're focused on the topic of how we accelerate progress on gender diversity in the sector, why it matters, and the role of leaders and regulators. We'll have discussions with energy sector leaders, with diversity and inclusion leaders and influencers, with regulatory experts, and with women who will share their experiences. And I'm also delighted that we will have a keynote message from the UK Energy Minister, the Right Hon Greg Hands. Then moving on to tomorrow, that is all about practical actions and sharing. So the theme tomorrow is strategies for success. And we're offering a series of workshops designed for those who are working on or influencing D&I in different organizations. In deciding on the workshops for tomorrow, we reached out to people in our network and asked them what was really important for them. And so based on that input, the workshops tomorrow are on inclusive leadership, hybrid working, unconscious bias, and microaggressions in the workplace. Now, places tomorrow are limited because we want the sessions to be really interactive, but there are just a few spaces left. So if you're interested and not registered yet, do please go to our website and find out how to register. And the workshops tomorrow will be run by some great D&I experts. So in advance, I'd like to say thank you. And that's to Enact Solutions, the Equal Group, STEPS, and TLC Lions. And I must say the sessions sound like a lot of fun. Now, as we're all very much aware, our energy sector is undergoing a revolution, and we need a revolution in diversity and inclusion as well, so that we're equipped for the challenges and opportunities ahead. So I would encourage you all to get the most out of the 2 days of this conference, using it as an opportunity really to engage, to learn, and to share experiences so we can all learn from each other. So I've got a few housekeeping tips. So first of all, this is all on an online platform, which allows us to make this event inclusive, and we do hope it will be as interactive as possible. So do please leave comments in the chat, and during the breaks you can network with each other, and you do that by clicking on directory, finding somebody that you want to connect with, and then you can click on the chat icon to the right hand side of their name. I'll remind you of that before we go into the first break. Social media, if you're on social media, please tweet away during the event. Tag Powerful Women and use the conference hashtag PFWConf, and we'll have that on our slides as a reminder. And then after the conference, we will have a recording of all the sessions, which we'll put on our Powerful Women YouTube site, and we will send a link to that on LinkedIn and on Twitter. So do please share with your colleagues. And then I think my last point here is to say a very big thank you to this year's conference sponsors. So that's to BP, EDF, E.ON, Ørsted, RWE, Scottish Power, SSE, Subsea 7 and Wood. That felt a bit like an Oscar acceptance speech, but fantastic support for the conference. And your support, sponsors, it really does help us to give practical support to the sector to achieve better diversity and inclusion. So now I'm delighted to welcome a message from the Right Honourable Greg Hands, Minister of State for Business, Energy and Clean Growth. Due to last-minute parliamentary business, the Minister has had to record his speech, but we're very grateful to him for doing that. Greg has been an MP since 2005, and he was appointed as Energy Minister in September. Before this, he was the Minister of State for Trade Policy in the Department for International Trade. And I would just like to mention that BEIS has been always a strong advocate for powerful women. And indeed, we really grew out of that department when we were founded in 2014. And their continued support and commitment to diversity and inclusion is very welcome. So with that, over to the speech from the Minister.
At the beginning of this month, nations came together to keep 1.5 alive by signing the Glasgow Climate Pact. It was a historic summit. But we know that commitments alone are not enough. The second part of the challenge is delivery, turning those words into action. While Glasgow may have returned to a state of relative quiet, the work cannot stop. We need to build on the momentum gained and see countries revisiting and strengthening their 2030 targets and developing net zero strategies. Another area where we cannot afford to take our foot off the pedal is gender. Without the skills, innovation, and leadership of women, a successful, equitable transition will be out of reach. It is an undeniable truth that I know this organisation does its very best to highlight. I'm pleased to say that Gender Day at COP26 was extremely productive and very well received. The day furthered ambition for a gender-sensitive transition to net zero, and we spoke about how girls' education can support climate action. The UK government strove to ensure the voices of women, especially those from developing countries, were heard at the summit, providing funding to the Women Delegates Fund to provide travel, support and networking opportunities. And I know Powerful Women hosted a great event. That commitment to ensuring female voices were heard at COP26 has paid dividends. The final pact explicitly calls on countries to increase the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in climate action, and to ensure that gender equality is a key consideration as they develop and implement climate policies. It's a critical step, but there is still more to do. That's why the work of Powerful Women is so important, bringing together a range of parties at both a national and international level. Powerful Women has been key to advancing diversity and inclusion in the energy sector since 2014. My department, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, helped set up the organisation and has been an enthusiastic supporter ever since. Globally, women make up just 22% of the oil and gas workforce and 32% of the renewable sector, and are disproportionately represented in lower paid admin jobs. It's simply not good enough. We know that gender balance is not only better for society, it's a boost for businesses' bottom lines and investment in innovation. A company with a diverse executive team is 21%, a full fifth more likely to have above average profitability and increase its innovation revenue by 19%. The steps Powerful Women is taking are helping spur this mission forward. You hold energy companies to account by publishing the number of women on their boards each year and provide practical support to help them improve. And you empower women to rise through the ranks through their mentoring program, networks, and visibility for senior women's career stories. I want to take this opportunity at your annual conference to thank you for your work. As a government, we're committed to improving diversity and inclusion as we strive to meet our net zero goals and unlock all the benefits of the green industrial revolution. 1 year on from the publication of the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, we have an economy-wide net zero strategy that will use the best of British technology and innovation to create jobs and meet our climate goals. Just last week, I was at Whiteley Wind Farm in Scotland near Glasgow to announce funding for what will be the UK's largest green hydrogen facility. The facility will bring scores of clean jobs to Glasgow, and I hope that many of them will be filled by women. Because while Powerful Women is focused on increasing representation at the top of the sector, clearly the same principle needs to cut right the way across. We need to see more women in green roles across the economy, bringing their skills to bear in new, well-paid jobs in their local communities across the United Kingdom. We know from the work of the UN that women are more vulnerable than men to the impacts of climate change. To achieve a just transition, we need to make space for them to be part of the solution as well. The first industrial revolution changed the course of history for good, but just think what more could have been achieved then if the whole of the talent pool had been utilised. For the green industrial revolution, we need to redress that imbalance and not make that same mistake all over again. Powerful Women is helping make that happen. Thank you again for your work, and I do indeed hope you have a very, very good conference. Thank you.
So our thanks to the Minister for, I think, really inspiring and compelling words there, which is just a great opening for this conference. Particularly appreciate all the kind words about Powerful Women and our work. And once again, let me just recognise the powerful role model that BEIS and the UK Civil Service are providing in setting ambitious targets for diversity. And I found it very powerful to hear their such firm commitment to putting diversity at the heart of the green industrial revolution. As the Minister said, it's an undeniable truth that we can only have a successful energy transition if we draw on the skills, innovation and leadership of everyone in society, including women. And that really is an excellent segue to the next part of our agenda here. So we're going to move into the first discussion of the day, which is continuing on our theme of diversity and inclusion for net zero, reflections on COP26. And I'd like to welcome now Lauren van der Kolk, who is Head of People Transformation and Reward at National Grid. Very, very good to see you, Lauren, after all the problems getting you into the webinar. So in this session now, Lauren and I are together going to give an introduction to a recent piece of work that's been done jointly between National Grid and Powerful Women. And it's looking into the importance of improving diversity, equity and inclusion if we are to deliver net zero. So Lauren, welcome. And I wonder, maybe we could start, if I could ask you just briefly to talk a bit about how these two different topics have really played a role in your career to date.
Thanks, Ruth, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk about these topics. So for me, I think
Okay, have we lost Lauren?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I think you might have a bandwidth problem.
Okay, well then, let me give it another go, and otherwise I'll turn off my video and you can hear my voice, hopefully. So
go again.
So the answer to your question, Ruth, is both these topics have been relevant throughout my career. I started as a engineer working for GE in the power industry, and diversity, equity, and inclusion became a really important theme to me because I was pretty much one of the only women. And in particular, as I advanced in my career, I saw it becoming ever more relevant. And as a partner at BCG, when I became a consultant, I faced a similar issue, being one of the only women working in energy. And more broadly, net zero has also been an important theme because I've spent my career working in utilities, and it's become an increasingly more important part of obviously the industry's priorities as well as utilities. And finally, in my role at National Grid, it's one of our biggest agendas as a company as a whole. So for me, these two topics have played an important role for me throughout my career. And maybe if I can ask you a question back, Ruth, I think it's quite interesting for everyone to hear how you came up with this idea, because of course you contacted me with this idea of doing a paper, and I think it'd be interesting to hear where it came from.
Okay. So if I think back in time with Powerful Women, so at the beginning, sort of 6-7 years ago, we were very much focused on the business case and the why is diversity and inclusion so important. And I think in those days, we very much drew on the myriad of research pieces that have been done, looking into the question of how more representation of women at senior levels in companies is strongly correlated with better financial performance. And actually the references that the minister made in his speech to the 21% is a typical example of that. But it's really struck me over the past few years as the sheer amount of change that's needed in the energy sector has become more apparent to address net zero. That really the energy sector needs to reinvent itself. And to do that, it's become more and more apparent that it's going to need real diversity of experience, diversity of thought, new ideas, different talent, and a really inclusive environment to achieve that. So I've actually found myself for probably at least 3 years now, when I speak at events like this on behalf of Powerful Women, I always talk very strongly about the importance of diversity and inclusion in supporting net zero. And indeed, it was a big theme, as we've just heard at COP. But it's never really been fleshed out very much. And so I thought it would be really interesting if we could just try to break that down more and say, so let's make sense of this. How is DEI so important to net zero? And what are the key things that therefore we should be acting? So that was my motivation. I suppose a lot of fascination. And to my delight, Lauren, when I got in touch with you, you said yes to helping with this work. So perhaps you could say a bit about why you said yes. And then, we went through quite a lot of talking. So talk a bit about how we came to the core thesis here, which is about DEI as a critical enabler for some of the key net zero challenges.
Well, to be honest, I think the chance to connect DE&I to net zero was super exciting. So it was an incredible opportunity. And in particular, you and I have talked many times about connecting diversity to really clear outcomes. There's been lots of research around connecting it to financial outcomes, but connecting it to such a purposeful and important agenda like net zero, I think was really quite different and actually quite hard. I think as we went through the process of looking at these two topics, we talked to lots of leaders across the industry, and we kept coming back to kind of some of the same things. We started first by thinking there would be some commonality between the two, as in things that would advance net zero would also have benefits for advancing DE&I. And that was rooted in the thinking that as we've learned around DE&I, lots more is important around behaviors and inclusion and the importance of creating a sustainable environment. And we know those things also foster innovation and other things. But as we talked to lots of leaders in the industry, it became very clear that the challenges of net zero, and you even referenced it yourself, Ruth, the amount of transformation required and the fundamental change of the economy and the industries needed was so material and so great that eventually it started to click. Ultimately, people are really going to be at the center of this change. And if you couple that with the need to find an equitable and fair net zero solution, you get quite logically to the realization that diversity is actually a fundamental role in addressing the challenges of net zero. And when you look at the challenges of net zero, actually many obvious things start to emerge around how DE&I can help the industry get where it needs to get to. And so I think that's kind of how we got to where we got to on the thesis and how we started to bring it all together. And maybe if I ask you a question back, Ruth, you've been on this journey with us as we've gone through all the research and talked to industry experts. And you also had the idea at the beginning, but was there anything as we went through this that surprised you the most about the research or where we ended up in terms of the findings?
Well, I could probably speak the rest of the morning on this. I've just found so much, I don't know about surprising, but just some things that have become so much clearer and crisper as a result of the work. And that ranges from things that in a sense are really obvious, but have really come into sharp focus for me. And just sort of maybe one example of that is, parallels between the two agendas. So net zero, very clear where we are. We've got now a lot of countries, and then an increasing number of companies have signed up and made net zero pledges and commitments. Sort of net zero by 2050, in some companies net zero by 2040, for example. But now, the absolute imperative now is to go from commitments into what's really got to happen. And actually, if I think about then for diversity and inclusion and what we've been driving at Powerful Women and what a lot of this conference is about, we've been really pushing for the commitments to be made, and now it's about how we get action. So an incredible parallel about the way you go about driving change, which I think the point you just made. Then insights from like from the survey that we did, where something that really stood out for me was that the majority of the respondents to our survey were really passionate themselves about both of these topics. And a lot of our respondents didn't seem to think that their direct managers and their middle managers had the same sort of passion and commitment as they did. So there was a real gap between what they perceived their middle managers and direct managers to think and how they felt about it. And then, digging into that even more, this point that for those who were less committed themselves, there was a strong correlation with their managers being less committed. So it really gives so much insight into what needs to happen to really drive things and make progress. And the other thing, Another thing that really struck me, and this came more from some of the interviews, were, and I hadn't really made this connection, a lot of parallels with COVID. So COVID is this huge crisis that affects everyone that we're having to deal with quite near term. And in making those parallels, we found examples where diversity was an essential part of driving the innovation that created vaccines and treatments. The criticality of having diverse clinical trials, and then the enormous efforts of harnessing multiple organizations and different groups together to drive programs, and the absolute criticality of getting buy-in and support from the whole population behind the actions that were being taken. And of course, that has been with mixed success, as we're seeing in different countries now. And so many things that we can learn from COVID that are highly relevant to the 1.5 degree challenge. And examples within that where diversity has been really important. And that was something that was completely new for me. And as I say, I could keep going, but rather than in this becoming a monologue. Lauren, I knew when I asked you to look at this with us that there's already quite a lot around today on DEI and net zero. So from this work, what do you think is different?
So I'm going to use a slide for this, Ruth. I think it's the
consultant.
Okay, great. But I think it starts when you look at the challenges. And so let me share a slide in parallel with everyone on the call. So hopefully you can see that.
Yep.
Great. So I think we first should start by acknowledging, and I said this from the beginning, there's a lot of good things about DE9 that we already know, and they are valid. And we need to build on those things, however. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't true, but it means that there's more. And I think there's 2 or 3 ways in particular where this work is quite different. And one of them I touched on, which is, I think this work takes diversity, linking it to outcomes in a different way, in a more concrete way. We've talked notionally around diversity for a long time with financials and innovation. And so that's perhaps one of the more obvious places when you look at the challenges of net zero shown on my slide, where we can say diversity is a benefit. But the report goes a bit further to understand, why is that a benefit? What is it about diverse teams that makes it actually deliver innovative solutions? And the answer is more complicated than it sounds. Diversity in and of itself is not enough. In fact, actually, one of the researchers we looked at talked about visible or inherent diversity and invisible or acquired diversity, which is becoming ever more a topic. And it stated that companies or organizations that are unable to prove or demonstrate that they value visible diversity never get the benefit of invisible diversity, and that the combination of the two together actually yields superior outcomes. So you need both. And so I think that's one example of how it shows what actually needs to happen to get the value. I think the other is, when we look at diverse teams, just having diverse people on the team isn't enough. You need to actually move beyond that. You need to have a culture that creates an environment where people feel safe to be who they are, safe to express what they think, and ultimately an environment where people challenge each other more. They call this creative friction. And in reality, that's actually something quite uncomfortable to everyone. And a difficult thing to work and live in. But those are the kinds of things that really create truly better outcomes and truly more innovative and novel, different types of thinking. And so that's one example. I think if I pick another one about something that's different, is in particular around consumers, which I think is something that's less been linked, especially in energy, to the value of diversity. And if you think about the net zero solutions and the differences, the structural differences in economies, in energy consumption between developing and developed worlds, you realize very quickly that consumer adoption is going to be super important. More than 1/4 of final energy consumption comes in the households. Households in many countries are run by women. Women are shown to be disproportionately more likely to take on energy-friendly solutions or environmentally friendly solutions. So the industry's awareness and understanding of diverse consumers that represent the broader part of society is really important. And another study by Harvard showed that organizations that have more diverse teams are 2 times more likely to understand the diverse needs of their consumers. And so those are 2 examples that I could probably talk forever, Ruth, about this topic if I'm not careful. But I think that's a little window or preview, if you will, about how the paper takes diversity and net zero to a slightly different level and adds something new to the challenge. I'll leave with one last thing that you referenced, which was a surprise for me. When we started this work and we did a survey across the industry, we asked people to indicate what motivated them to do action or take action in diversity types of agendas and net zero. And the hypothesis that we started with was that net zero would be a very purposeful driven agenda, that people would overwhelmingly comment that they did it for the greater good of mankind effectively. But that diversity would be a slightly different agenda, would be more personable for themselves or for people that they know, but it wasn't. Very interestingly, people overwhelmingly stated that both are very purposeful driven agendas. And I think that's also something quite interesting as well. And I know that that's a point, Ruth, that you also found quite interesting in the study, isn't it?
Yeah, and yes, and Lauren, it really links to something that I feel very strongly is really important in general, which is this point about sort of purpose-led business, where businesses, companies, organizations have a clearly defined purpose about how they deliver value, and that's value to all stakeholders, not just sort of old-fashioned shareholder value. And I think that when companies have that sort of purpose, that can then be that North Star that really unlocks that purpose-led motivation right through the organization, which I think is an incredibly powerful driver. And then, and it's coming back to then how do you actually drive things? So, and I think the next step that I'm looking at both in D&I and in terms of net zero is how do we then make sure that that purpose encompasses the drive for net zero and the drive for much better inclusive cultures and truly diverse organizations, so that right from the purpose down, that then informs all of the strategy, and responsibility for delivery is absolutely at the top of the organization. Delivery is not delegated to a sustainability team or a D&I team. It's absolutely core to what the organization is all about. And I think that that's what we really need to see more of now. And I think we'll hear more about that in this conference today. I wonder, Lauren, you talked about consumers, and I wonder if you could say a bit more about what we found there, because that has really struck me. That's one of my big ahas from this work. And I mean, actually, I feel quite humble about it, because it makes me realize that we have collectively, we've got to let go and let everyone make the decisions and drive the agenda, not just people who feel more used to driving the agenda on critical topics. So say a bit more about that, if you will.
I think that's right. I mean, I think there are probably 2 or 3 points that I would add to the point around consumers. And the first is that research is showing that minorities are overwhelmingly the most affected group right now around climate change. And one study even said 80% of individuals that have been displaced by climate change related events are women. So we know that they are an underrepresented group. I talked a bit about how the importance of diversity in linking into developing better solutions for more diverse populations is also very important. And I think there's probably a third point, which is consumers themselves can actually be very strong advocates of change in themselves, but also in others. And I think there's actually a very interesting example that demonstrates that quite well, which is the fair trade example. And the fair trade example was developed by a woman who was quite poor in a developing country. And she scaled the idea because they needed an economic solution to create money for farmers locally. So it's firstly an example of how good ideas often come from the minorities themselves because they recognize the situation that they're in. But I think the second element of this example shows the power of consumers, which is, when the idea scaled and consumers were educated and empowered to make choices about how they bought products, and they were able to discern between a fair trade product and a not fair trade product, at scale, they could influence supply chains of companies quite quickly. And so if you think of that power in an energy context, in a net zero context, you can imagine an empowered consumer can drive a lot of change in companies, supply chains, if they are educated, aware, and understand some of the choices they can make about the things they buy or the things they use and how they use energy. At National Grid, we did a study as part of our Greenlight project that looked at how consumers understand energy. And we found an overwhelming majority of individuals in the UK have a completely skewed perception of how much energy is generated by renewables or how much energy they use in their own house. And it shows that there's lots of work to do in the industry to educate consumers, to empower consumers, to enable them to make better choices as well. So again, I could talk forever about this topic, but I think it's one of the most interesting things that's come out of the work so far today.
Yeah, which I guess is a huge opportunity, but also for this industry a huge challenge. So we're going to be on a very big learning curve. So Lauren, the report is due out in January, so it's still work in progress. But do you feel willing to give a sort of bit of a hint of what's coming with recommendations?
Absolutely. I will resort to some slides again, just so I think they help illustrate some of the key points actually quite nicely. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully that's come through. So I think we touched on this a little bit.
Not showing yet. Oh yeah.
I think we touched on this a little bit, but it's an important preface to the recommendations that will come out of the report. And the first is there's an overwhelming conclusive view across the industry of who really needs to be responsible to drive some of the change. And when we looked at the responsibility around DE&I and the responsibility around net zero, you can see that companies sit very firmly in the top. There's a very strong perception that companies in particular across the industry have the responsibility to act on both agendas. And that coupled, of course, with government and regulators to drive some of the change needed for net zero. And I think that's a very important point, because if you think about what needs to happen, these are the stakeholders that really need to take action quickly. And coupling that, of course, with something that's probably not surprising, but still an overwhelming majority of individuals are demanding more. And everyone is saying this, but we need more much faster, to the point where this has actually inspired the name of the paper, the net zero race. This is a race. The next 10 years is very important, but people say that the next year is important, and the year after that, we need to start to make material progress to be able to meet our targets by 2050. So if I share a little bit about some of the recommendations coming out of the report, they fall into broadly 3 categories. And these came from, again, lots of interviews and lots of perceptions in the surveys and the studies we've done around what are the things that are perceived to benefit DE&I and net zero in the most impactful way. And I think the first is it links to this purposeful agenda point. And there's more here than meets the eye. It's, when we say make DE&I and net zero core to your business, it has to go beyond the notional to the actual. You talked about it, Ruth. This has to translate all the way down to middle managers really feeling that this is an important part of their agenda and driving that into the work they do day to day. It's about setting targets, really holding leaders in the organization account to those targets. The second talks about talent, and we've always talked about talent around DE&I, but here there's a more important point when you think about net zero challenge, We know that net zero is going to create something like 250,000 jobs in the UK in the next 10 or so years. And many of those jobs, about half of them, are going to require new skills. So we need to tap into way more diverse pools of individuals. We need to experiment more with talent in organizations and take risks with people and put them into different situations, so that we can benefit a truly diverse workforce, not just in terms of visible diversity, but also in terms of invisible diversity as well. And quite linked to that is innovation. And you touched on this as well, Ruth, around COVID. There's quite a lot here about the importance of diversity and making sure that it is actually generating and helping organizations deliver more innovation. And so this is about ensuring visible diversity is truly an important part of the agenda, that it's represented in the leadership throughout the organization. And then more importantly, that the culture that the organization has is very much reinforcing. At National Grid, we're taking this actually quite seriously. Culture is a very soft thing, and measuring behaviors of leaders is quite tricky. But we now measure behaviors of our leaders on an annual basis to make sure that the behaviors that they are putting forth and that they're perceived are ones that are creating much more of an inclusive environment that fosters ultimately diversity and then also enables innovation. Without giving too much more away, I think those are the three categories of recommendations. And it gives a little bit of a sense of what's coming in January. So I'm guessing we're probably getting pretty close to time, Ruth. If I just ask you one last question, maybe, what will you take away from this work? And what are the things, what are the conclusions you take away? How will you do something different going forward?
Well, I think I'll be very brief, Lauren. So I think, for me personally, since I stopped being an executive and I now have a portfolio of many different non-executive roles, and with those, I very much followed what I really care about. So that's why I'm the chair of Powerful Women and do some other things around DEI, because I really care about that. I'm also involved with Chapter Zero, which is really seeking to drive action by companies on climate change through their board members. One of my big takeaways is how, these started out in my life being sort of separate things I was passionate about, but actually they're so much pulled together, and this work has really given sort of grounding for that. And so many parallels in terms of what's needed to drive progress. So I think, my takeaway is that I'm going to it's very empowering, actually. I'm going to just be out there making this connection, drawing comparisons on a much stronger basis, and using that as another catalyst to drive much more focus on action now. And so that's what I'm going to do.
Very good.
And what about you? Same question.
I think there's probably two things I would reflect on. I think the importance of line managers, which we talked about in particular, has really struck me. And I think we spend a lot of time in organizations talking about leadership's role in setting an example. And I will focus a lot more on, me personally, managers that work for me. Talking about these topics, making sure they're relevant, making sure they're reflected in their objectives and the things that they're doing, and that it's filtering down into their teams, is one. And I think the second is probably the biggest insight for me, is the amount of pace required and change. So I actually now spend time every week, I was planning my week like most people, but as part of that, I think about, what am I going to do this week? How can I incorporate an element of this agenda into what I do? I do head group award at National Grid, so I probably have some levers in my toolbox that are helpful, and I do use them. But I think just actively thinking about that is actually quite helpful for me, and it does often result in lots of things that I wouldn't have thought of if I hadn't taken the time to do so. And so that's my personal reflection of some of the change that it's happening with me.
Okay, well, Lauren, thank you very much, first of all, for this session, and thank you for all the work and the insights. And I think we've got a video, haven't we?
We do indeed.
Do you want to show the video quickly, and then I'll say thank you and we'll move on to the next part of this session?
Yes, so what I will say is CEO of National Grid, John Pettigrew, very much wanted to be here, but unfortunately we just couldn't make it work with investor meetings. So he has recorded a video to play for you all because these are two very important topics to him personally. And so let me just play his video. Technology hopefully works. Can you see it on screen? Yes, I hope so.
I'm John Pettigrew, the CEO of National Grid. Sorry I can't join you today, but I want to say how excited I am about the collaboration between National Grid and Powerful Women. Together, we're shining a light on two incredibly important topics, net zero and diversity, equity and inclusion. Both are vital for the future of business and society, and both are important to me at a very personal level as well. As we all know, climate change is the greatest challenge of our generation. And as an energy company, National Grid has a critical role to play in tackling it. That's why we partnered with COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference, which took place last month. Getting to grips with climate change is no longer a question of if. It's a question of when. On the journey to net zero, the world's been jogging up to now. In some cases, just walking, which is sprinting. And we know net zero is achievable. If we look at the growth in offshore wind in the UK, we see a great example of what can be done, but we need to do more, we need to do it faster. COP26 has given us a strong platform to build from. Whilst we can't underestimate the challenge of decarbonising our energy systems, we can have confidence that there's a strong resolve globally to make it happen. Of course, we need to be innovative in developing new energy solutions, and that will require a collective effort and a whole range of fresh thinking and new skills. If we start with the basic principle that people are our catalyst for change, then it's clear we need a truly diverse net zero workforce. The race to net zero will create over 400,000 new jobs across the UK alone. More than half of these are needed to build and upgrade energy infrastructure on a massive scale. This is fundamental to ensure the energy future is clean, fair and affordable for all. That's National Grid's vision as a company, and we're working hard to play our part in it. We make commitments to be a diverse organisation that's truly representative of the communities we serve, one that values inclusion and equity. We're focused on inspiring future talent and motivating young people to pursue STEM education. And we're proactively helping to build the capabilities and skills needed so that workers of all ages and backgrounds and from every corner of the UK can be part of our net zero energy workforce. So as we begin this critical decade for climate action, we need to put people, energy and action at the heart of the solution. That's something we can all work together to achieve. And I'm really excited for this opportunity. I hope you are too. So have a great conference. As you go through the day, I'd urge you to reflect on discussions and how you and your organisations can help drive the change we need to deliver the clean energy future. Thank you.
Okay, so Lauren, that was breaking up a little bit, my end at least. So hopefully we will have the clearances to provide a link to that somewhere so people can listen to it again. I could hear it just about, but I'm sure we can provide a link so that people can listen to it in a sort of clearer version. Lauren, once again, thank you very much for this, I think, incredible piece of work. Look out for it to all the participants on the conference. I hope that's really aroused your interest in the report. I think it's a report into the essential links between better diversity and inclusion and achieving a 1.5 degree world or not. So, you know, the stakes, as you said, are very high. Look out for this in January. And Lauren, thank you so much indeed for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And now, so we've now got one more bit before we're going to have a break. And it's now very much coming to the Powerful Women agenda overall that's driving today's conference. And if I could maybe have I've got a few slides here, so if I could have those up, thank you. So I think it's a good time to remind ourselves where we're at in terms of female representation in the UK energy sector and just the scale of the challenge that we're facing here. And in this, I'm going to provide a few examples where we're making progress, where companies really are making a difference. And I think my summary would be that there's more and more evidence of good things happening, but on the other hand, we really do need to see much faster progress. So if we could go to the next slide. So for those of you on this conference today who aren't familiar with Powerful Women and this conference, so we're an initiative, a professional initiative, and our mission is to increase the representation of women at the top of the UK energy sector. We work collaboratively with a whole range of great diversity initiatives in both energy and other sectors. And our very strong belief here is that we want to be partnering, scaling up and amplifying efforts. So a lot of collaboration. And we are more aware than ever that diversity of every kind is important. In Powerful Women, clearly our focus is on women, but much of our work, and indeed the work of the companies in our network, are really targeting creating inclusive cultures where everyone feels that they can contribute and thrive. And that is going to support diversity of every dimension. So Powerful Women, we've set targets. So our targets are to have 30% of executive director roles and 40% of middle management roles to be held by women by 2030. And when we look at statistics, we do focus on the largest employers in the UK energy sector. And I should say that in our work, I'll go on to say some of the things we do, but in our work, we have, as you've heard, a very close and constructive relationship with the BEIS department. We also have a strong partnership with the Energy Institute and the support of our sponsoring companies. And the three key ways, the three key activity areas that we use to drive progress. So first of all, campaigning and reporting, and that's very much about publishing our annual statistics. Support for women in their careers includes our mentoring scheme and networking events. And practical support for companies is very much really what we're doing today and tomorrow on this conference. So if we go now to the next slide, please. So in 2015, we had our first look at the numbers to see where we stood compared to the targets we were setting. And as I mentioned, for measurement, we actually use the top 80 UK employers in the energy sector. Back in 2015, by the way, we had just 5% of executive board seats and 11% of overall board seats held by women. And on this chart, you can see that we have been making some progress. So for each year, the left hand is the representation of overall board seats and the right hand column is the representation at executive director seats. And the targets are the Hampton-Alexander 33% target by 2020 for overall seats and our 30% target by 2030 for executive director seats. And then the next slide, if we could have that. So this shows the overall picture for 2021. And this was compiled in April in work done with PwC UK. And you've heard already and seen already, actually, that 24% of overall board seats, 14% of executive director seats. Bottom left here, more than a quarter of boards out of those top 80 companies still having no women. And while we do have now 15 companies that 15 companies out of 80 meet our target for executive board seats, you can see bottom right that more than 3/4 have no women at all in executive director positions. And I think that it's fair indeed to say that compared with the imperative for progress and urgency related to net zero, as the Energy Minister said, it's simply not good enough. The next slide, if we could move. So this looks at the energy sector compared to other sectors. So on the left-hand side, we're comparing with FTSE 100 and FTSE 250 boards. And you can see that they're at 36% and 33% respectively. By the way, I think we may expect to see higher targets set in the next incarnation of Hampton-Alexander, given the fact that the 33% target's already been reached. And that all compares with energy at 24%. And then this on the right-hand side of this chart. So this is based on the UK Labour Force Survey of 2021. And it's looking at female representation in different industries, the left of these two parts. Down at the bottom, you can see transport, mining and construction, but electricity and gas are sitting fifth from bottom here at 26% from this survey. And then the right-hand side with all these blocks. This is looking at female representation in higher position of leadership, which here is defined as managers, directors, and senior officials. And electricity and gas on this chart is that one in green, highlighted in green down at the bottom right. And whilst the definitions here are not the same as our board statistics, within the same survey, you can look at the relative position of different sectors, and you can see gas and electricity right down at the bottom. The answer is it's not good. Now, the next slide, if we could go there. So this is, I'm not sure, I can't see the title here properly. It should be What Are Women in Energy Telling Us in 2021? I think it's very important that we listen to the voice of women in the sector. And this is where the annual Women in Energy Global study is really helpful. Powerful Women supported this, and we were pleased to partner in the 2021 edition together with NES Faircroft and Energy Jobline. It's a global survey of about 3,000 participants, and it gives us an authentic voice of women in the sector. If I just pull out maybe 3 points from here. So firstly, for women, the clean energy transition is the strongest motivation for working in energy. You can see some of the statistics at the top here. And in particular, this point that the climate change agenda was cited by the highest number of respondents as the thing that excites them most about the sector. But on the other hand, women found that their career progression has been damaged by the pandemic. You see the 39% of respondents saying that. And then we get the key asks of companies. So what women are asking for is more sponsored training and learning and the continuation of flexible and remote working after the pandemic. And I think it's particularly noteworthy, this 46% here might say my company has no formal mentoring program or I don't know of any. And if they don't know about it, it's probably not achieving very much. So I think from this survey, there are some positive messages, but there are also some stark messages to us from women in the sector, and a clear set of asks that we need to pay attention to if we're going to unleash their motivation and potential. So if we could, I think I'll skip the next slide and go on to that one. Yeah. So you saw this from the video, actually. So at the launch of our board statistics back in June, I said then that I was less and less interested in the why of improving diversity and inclusion is essential, because I just think it's very well established. And as I've said, the climate emergency is making this even more self-apparent and urgent at a frightening pace. But I am really interested in the how. And at the heart of driving any successful high-scale change, there has to be powerful, effective leadership. At Powerful Women, we believe that that needs to be visible leadership, making commitments, and then, as the Energy Minister said, delivery that turns actions into words, and then reporting on actions and progress and role modeling good practice. So next slide, please. I'm delighted today to announce the 3rd annual report of the Energy Leaders Coalition. So the Energy Leaders Coalition is now in its 4th year, and it comprises leaders of 16 of the UK's largest energy employers, who together have more than 100,000 employees. So that's significantly more than half of the UK energy workforce. When these leaders sign up to join the ELC, they're making a public commitment to increase gender diversity and inclusion in their companies and across the sector. And I'm going to give you a sneak preview in a couple of slides now of what's in this report launched today. So the next slide. So I know that you can't possibly read this, but we are publishing the 16 companies' progress against their own diversity and inclusion targets. So this is on the left here is company by company. And what I'd like to pull out is that we have some instances here of really strong measurable targets, and quite a number that are assessed as green or on track by the companies. But on the other hand, some companies are acknowledging that they're running behind where they need to be, and some of the targets probably need sharpening up. But I think that either way, what's really compelling here is that we've got leaders who are prepared to put out in the public, these are our targets, these are our commitments, this is how we're doing, and therefore allowing themselves to properly be held to account. And on the right-hand side here, we're showing where each company sits compared to the overall targets that I talked about before. And just to pull out a couple of facts here. So we now have 6 members of the ELC that meet the Powerful Women target for the representation at executive director level, and 4 companies who meet both that and the Hampton-Alexander target for overall board seats. So, there is some progress. Next slide, also from the report. So this is right, so it's a good job I have got page numbers on my notes, so I don't have to go into the forgive me mode. What actions are making a difference? So for this report, we asked the ELC companies to tell us examples of policies or initiatives that they think are making a real difference. And we asked them specifically to provide case studies that are data-led with tangible outcomes. And a few things here stood out. So just a few examples. So new approaches to recruitment advertising that in one instance helped to create a gendered balanced apprenticeship program. We've heard about a leadership program that's now 32% female, having been 13% female at its launch 4 years ago. We heard about a development program for women in middle management that has led to positive career moves for 3/4 of the participants. And we heard about improvement to one company's maternity leave that has supported women into 26% of senior management and 33% of middle management roles. And there are a lot more examples besides. I encourage you to read the report where you'll get the details of exactly how these have been achieved. And of course, these are isolated incidents and, they need to be scaled up and made much more comprehensive. But I am encouraged by these instances of data-driven and outcome-focused initiatives. And a big thank you to the D&I leads from the ELC companies for providing these examples. Next slide, please. So the ELC has also committed and set as an objective to work together as a collective, as well as the things they're doing in their own companies. And in the report, we're highlighting 3 areas that's been addressed during the last year. So first of all, this don't let diversity be a casualty of COVID. The CEOs issued a statement jointly earlier this year, committing to keeping gender on the agenda through the pandemic. They were conscious of evidence showing that women's careers have been disproportionately affected. And we saw that in that Women in Energy study that I talked about earlier. And that had the risk of derailing all the effort and drive to retain and develop female talent. So the CEOs pledged to take steps to keep diversity at the heart of their thinking during the period of change, with a number of examples cited in that statement. Then on STEM outreach, so like many others, the ELC is really keen to strengthen the talent base of women with STEM skills available to the industry. And the CEOs commissioned a joint piece of work looking at all the different STEM outreach programs that the different companies conduct that's led to a methodology that can be used for assessing just how effective they are. And thirdly, I've talked a bit about the expansion of the ELC. They've also really strengthened the engagement and collaboration with the energy regulators, so much so that earlier this year, the CEOs of Ofgem and the Oil and Gas Authority have become formal members of the ELC and now join the regular meetings. And then lastly, if we can go on, so year 4 priorities that are spelled out in the report. So the ELC are going to continue to really make this link and focus on the link between net zero and a diverse and inclusive workforce. So they'll be building out on the recommendations from the report that Lauren and I have just been talking about. Then they're going to turn their attention to the experiences of women at mid-career level. How can mid-career level women be supported and developed to progress through the pipeline? For this, the ELC will be able to draw on some research that Powerful Women has commissioned with Bain, which looks at cultural barriers to women's advancement and highlights the transformative nature of sponsorship, development, role modeling, and inclusive cultures. And finally, the ELC will continue to meet regularly to share, learn, and challenge openly and honestly amongst themselves. This will include reevaluating their progress to 2030 targets and exploring how to accelerate progress. And I think what's coming through loud and clear in terms of ambitions for the coming year is that there's a desire not just to continue this collaboration, but to actively step up their work to bring their commitments to life. So you'll have a chance to hear from some of the ELC leaders shortly, and I would urge you to look at this report. And so to conclude, last slide, please. The importance of driving diversity and inclusion is more apparent than ever. And we need faster practical actions that will close the gender gap. And we're going to hear more about that after the break now. So I'd like to thank you. In the next session, we'll continue the discussion on the role of leadership in driving diversity and inclusion. And we'll be joined by the heads of 3 UK energy companies and other female leaders and experts in the sector. So we'll have a break now for 10 minutes. And during the break, participants are welcome to network with each other as I've described. So click directory, find the person you want to connect with, click the chat icon to the right-hand side of their name. Good luck with that, good chatting, and we'll reconvene. We'll reconvene at 11, well, by 11:50 at the latest. Thank you.
Testing sound.
Okay, so welcome back, everybody. I hope that there was some good connections and networking going on. Our next session this morning is entitled, What should business leaders be doing to accelerate change? Are we accountable, visible, and inclusive enough? And I'm delighted now to hand over to Colette Cohen, OBE, CEO of Net Zero Technology Centre, who will be moderating this discussion and will introduce our esteemed panelists. So Colette, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, Ruth. I'm really looking forward to this session, particularly following on from the sobering and challenging data that you shared with us in the first session. So I think this will be a great event. I'm delighted today to be welcoming Cavendish Nuclear, Ørsted and Scottish Power, who are all members of the Energy Leaders Coalition that Ruth referenced earlier. And they're going to be able to share some of the actions that they've taken to kind of drive change in our sector. But I think we're also going to challenge them a little bit as to whether they're doing enough. So we've Accenture and Equinor who are here to ask those questions and to be a little bit provocative. It should be a super conversation. So let me introduce our panelists. Dominic Kieran, Managing Director of Cavendish Nuclear. Duncan Clark, Head of Region for Ørsted, Melissa Stark, Managing Director of Accenture, Lindsay McQuaid, CEO of Scottish Power Renewables, and Hannah Mary Goodlad, Head of Baltic Sea Area Development, Equinor. If we can all make sure our cameras are on, let's get started. So the aim of this session is to explore the role of leadership in advancing gender diversity and inclusion, and to have some really good, honest conversations about what's working and what isn't. So I would like, following on from Ruth's commentary, to really ask ourselves, what are those faster practical actions that we could take to impact diversity? So can I start with Melissa? Melissa, hello. Based on the analysis that Accenture does, do you think that the energy companies are doing enough? And is there somebody that is an exemplar in this sector or another sector that you could, talk about?
Well, maybe if I start with just explaining Accenture and my role, and then how we think about diversity in the workforce. So I look after renewables and energy transition services globally for Accenture. So that's about more than 10 different countries and markets. And so definitely a senior role in the firm that I've been with for over 28 years. So I've been at Accenture for over 28 years, and the majority of that time has been working in energy and utilities. So I have seen the industry change from when I was 1 in 20, like the only woman in a room of 20, to one where I'm actually half the room is women, which has been fantastic. We have 275,000 women that work at Accenture, and we have a target to hit gender balance, so parity, 50% women by 2025. So in 4 years. So I think that's the benchmark that I hold my wonderful energy and utilities colleagues, and I know Lindsay pretty well, I hold them to as well. So I think that there are a few things that I've seen in the industry, I've experienced myself, that I like and that I want to see more of. So one is working flexibly. I worked flexibly for 18 years, and it's been fine. Right. And I work so many time zones. I'm calling in now from California. I spend half my time in Europe and in the US now. And I think working flexibly is good, not just for from the working mothers, but for everyone. And we've seen that with COVID. And we've seen families work very differently given how they've had to work around schools and everything else. So I think I'm a huge fan of flexible working, as I've said, doing that for 18 years. And I think we should be doing more of that, and allowing the husbands or the partners of women to be working flexibly only helps the women as well, right? So let both parents parent. Which is one of kind of our mantras, is let both parents parent. And I think the flexibly is not just for women. The second thing is around networks and getting connected. So I've been a member of the Energy Institute for a super long time. Now that I'm in my 50s, I'm not a young professional anymore, but I was at one point. And I do think that having a lot of different networks and seeing women in a lot of different modes makes a difference. So at the country level for us, or for your industry, or for things that are of common interests. So the network isn't only like a single network or a single point of failure. You end up developing lots of different networks where you see women in different leadership roles and how they do their roles differently. So I think lots of different networks, and I've seen that in the industry, which has been great. And then the third thing, which has been talked a lot about here, is around the mentorship. So in Accenture, I've had the same career counselor for over 20 years. And I did ask for a woman 20 years ago in 2000 something, when there was a change and I had an opportunity. And I'm fortunate to have the same woman been my career counselor for over 20 years. And she has seen me have children and work part-time and go through so many different jobs and promotions. And I think it's been really, really valuable. And then in Powerful Women, I also have a mentor, Paul Spence, who works at EDF. And I've known him because at a long time ago, before he was at EDF, he worked at Accenture, and I just knew him then. So when the opportunity came up to choose a mentor, he was my mentor, and he has been my mentor since the program started. And it's valuable to have somebody who actually doesn't work for Accenture, who's only thinking about you. And that's been great. And then I have a mentee, Sobrana Ra, who works at the Crown Estate. She was at Orsted and now she's at Crown Estate. So we have our own family, and we've been a mentor-mentee Powerful Women family since 2014 or 15 when it started. So I do think that whole arrangement that the Powerful Women has done has been really, really, really positive for me, and I think for the industry. And I've seen it in the senior women that I have the pleasure to work with in renewables. So I think those are three things that I've seen lots of different energy companies do. And I see that diversity in the boards and in the projects and in the leadership that I'm able to work with.
Super, thank you. Let me bring in Dominic there. You've just heard some really nice practical examples of things that have impacted Melissa's career and helped her through. And actually, some of them I've experienced myself. Do you think that particularly male leaders champion that enough in their industry and in your company? So, do you feel like mentoring and the networks, because sometimes I feel there's stigmas around the networks, that being part of them isn't always championed or encouraged. So how do you see those being sort of used effectively in your world?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, maybe just to answer that, if you wouldn't mind, maybe I'll just take a step back just to talk a little bit about a piece of work that we've done, and it kind of answers the question. So Cavendish Nuclear is part of the nuclear industry, and we were privileged to get support from an organisation called Women in Nuclear, who I have to say are absolutely fantastic. And they came in to help us look at how could we get from where we are today to a commitment we've all made in the nuclear sector deal, which is actually 40% female by 2030. And we don't differentiate between layers in that commitment. And so they actually came in and helped us look at how do we do that, and what levers are available for us as leaders to help change that sort of dynamic. And I think the answer is that it's pretty challenging, and it's pretty challenging in industries like ours where the turnover is very low. And so in looking at that level of challenge and looking at our starting point, it's quite stark on the slides from Ruth earlier where the energy industry sits. I think the honest answer is across the board, we aren't doing enough, because we are looking at our commitments and saying it's not easy to get to them. But what I would say is that there are lots of things that we can do, but there's no rule book here. So somebody earlier said that there's a little bit of trial and error here, as well as learning from others. So what is great is one of the things we do as we come together as the Energy Leaders Coalition is, we have some really frank conversations about what's working for us, what's not working for us, and try and sort of piggyback off each other's successes. I think what we're seeing is there are so many different approaches we're going to have to put in place. And we've mentioned a few now about flexible working and networks. A lot of it as well is, how attractive are we as an industry? Some of the things that we've been doing a lot of thinking of recently is, how do we actually use COVID to our benefit, and how do we start, when we go out to recruit, make sure that we're sort of throwing the net as wide as we possibly can, which is both offering flexible working, but also sort of geographic diversity around the UK. Because actually the days of having to be within commuting distance of your office, I think, have gone. And so that opens up lots of opportunities. So I think, Colette, are we doing enough? No, I think just looking at the data I saw, there is more we need to do, because it is quite a challenge to live up to our commitments. But I think we are starting, at least as an industry, to sort of come together and have those conversations and see if we can accelerate what we're doing.
Super. Building on that, Duncan, can I come to you? As Dominic mentioned, you're part of the ELC. You are sharing experiences, you are sharing what works and what doesn't work. Are there a couple of things that you could kind of encourage us with and share that you think are working and that are being picked up by others? And that you're already doing in Orsted or about to do?
There are some, and we know we've got to be more attractive to be able to tap into a bigger pool of more diverse talent. We're in a great place right now because we're clean and digital and purpose-led, and we're not really that dirty, heavy industrial, perhaps the old reputation of energy. And I think there are some areas of energy which are going through an incredible transformation, and that will mean cohorts of new roles. And that's our chance to just do things in a very, very different way, to try and tackle in some of our areas, our technical areas in particular, our field areas in particular. It has been hard work getting the talent pool growing, getting it more diverse. And what we've seen recently is that where we have, for example, cohorts of technicians to work on our offshore wind farms, we can do a program of recruitment, and we can tailor that recruitment so that we're thinking about it differently. And instead of asking for someone who's done that job before, because we know those people aren't there, we're going through a transformation. So what we're doing is reframing how we do our recruitment, reframing the language we use, making it simpler, making the language less traditional energy and male oriented, and actually making it appealing to a much broader range of people. And actually what we've seen is, if you combine that then with better recruitment practices, assessment practices, we've been able to significantly increase the proportion of women who we've taken into those recent intakes. So it gives me hope that we can do this, and we can do this not just in our commercial and legal and financial and corporate roles, where we have had success, but we can do it also in those other areas that have been difficult up to now.
Brilliant. I'm going to ask Hannah Mary, does she think we're all doing enough? Because we're talking about where we think we're doing stuff, but you're in more the sort of start of your career. You're looking at us with fresh eyes. What do you think? Do you think we're doing enough, or would you like to challenge these great leaders sitting here and say, there's more that you could do?
Yes, I hope you can hear me okay. I've had a bit of problems with my speakers, but you're all nodding, so that's great. Of course, we can always do more. And I think that we need to always be striving to do more, to increase the accessibility and to make ourselves better. That's how we manage to get to that next step. And, I sort of reflect, and I'm hearing what the panelists are saying, and I agree with a lot of this. I like to draw parallels in life, and I see a big parallel. I come from Equinor, and safety is really important to us. And we've built our safety culture up over the last few decades to really be something that you don't leave at the office door. And it's something that you take home with you, and you take it into your daily life, and you take it into your networks, into your family. And it's not something that starts at 9 o'clock and finishes at 5. I would really like to see diversity and inclusion have that same sort of expansion culture where we live and breathe this. And it's something that we don't just tick a box in 9 to 5 and we see it as a target in the office place. But it affects our networks. It affects the stuff that we do after work. Because we all know that a lot of the connections that we make outside work help us on that next rung up. And if we're going to limit our stuff outside work to being that more traditional aspects on excluding certain genders and certain people, I think we're limiting ourselves to really be living and breathing this. So to me, that parallel with safety is really important. This needs to become something that we live and breathe. It needs to become something that's our bread and butter, and it just becomes natural. This is the way of working, and this is who we are as people in the energy industry, and we elevate the standards that way.
Brilliant. I think that maybe, Lindsay, that brings me to a lovely challenge to you. You know, we talked about this session being about whether leaders are accountable, visible, and inclusive, and actually going on from that, like all the time, not just when they're ticking a box or when they turn up to a D&I meeting, but are they living this and showing it as an example within their company and you know, creating that value around them? What do you think? And what do you do to live that?
So I guess it's about that continual challenge and that sort of self-check, self-reflect as you're going about your business in a day-to-day. I would imagine that Melissa and I have probably been kicking about the sector for quite some time. I joined the energy sector in 1999 when obviously I was very young. But and the one thing I would say is that what a different place it is in 2021, much to my delight. But I still recognise that we've got a hell of a journey to go on. A lot of what Hannah Mary's talked about as well, I find I'm drawing parallels with what we need to be doing. From a Scottish Power perspective, it is about changing and challenging those policies, procedures, approaches that are very ingrained in some of the more traditional business areas of the energy sector. So, you know, it is the obvious practical things like ensuring language is right, ensuring that you feel that you're in a safe place to challenge if you observe something, getting the terminology right, creating that discussion where it's okay to turn around to somebody and say, that's really not how I think you should be referring to women. Or so I've called out in meetings that we've had, and again you see a culture shift. You do it in a way that your colleagues respect and they then reflect on the fact that you have felt uncomfortable in certain of these meetings. I recall doing it at a management meeting when I was in a more junior position, and I called out the difference between referring to me as a girl and the others in the room as men. And I was the only girl in the room. Mm-hmm. And I said, could you understand that makes me feel inferior? It makes me feel anxious. I don't have the same level of confidence. And most of all, I'm not respected. I'm not on a level footing. I'm being infantilized. I'm not being treated as an adult. So calling it out is important. And being in a position where you feel secure enough to do so is really important. So that's one example from within Scottish Power. I've also had the privilege of being one of the founding sponsoring directors of Renewable UK's Shadow Board. Now, this was not just about women, this was about diversity in its broadest sense. And I think working with what are a fantastic group of future leaders that are going to be coming through that pipeline that we talk about has been really insightful for me. And much like Hannah Mary's talked about safety, they open their meetings not only with a safety contact, but with a D&I contact, because they want to share stories, recognise where things have happened positively, and understand how they can share those learnings, those experiences, those approaches within their organisations as well. So seeing that coming through really made me reflect on how I approach it with my management team as well. You know, there is a huge amount to do. The report, the ELC report, is great because, to my mind, there's a lot of practical steps in there about what's happening. It's real advice about how other companies all the way through the supply chain could replicate the successes that some of the larger organizations are having as well. So it's not something reserved for the larger companies. That has to become, as has been talked about, part of our bread and butter, part of our culture, part of how we do our business.
Super. Melissa, you talked about actually being in a company now that has 50% women in the room when you walk in, which is kind of what we all aspire to. And it creates that comfort as well. Lindsay talks about being comfortable enough to challenge. I actually think you need to have more than just you being in there. It's really hard for a single woman to be that challenge. And so looking at the guys, it's really helpful when the guys put in the challenge in the room. But what do you think, you know, these companies could do? How has Accenture got there? What are the steps they've taken that have allowed them to get to this 50% equity?
So that's our target. So we're not at 50% yet. So it's 50% by 2025. I think in my room, it's 50%. So my leadership team of about 12 people is 50-50. So my team is 50-50. So in our rooms, it is most of the rooms I am in, it is 50%. But Accenture's target is 50% by 2025. I think hiring, we are at 49% in like hiring in, and our board is 50%. But middle management, which is really important, right? Because that's that pipeline of people that come in. The 40% target, which is a powerful women target, we're at 30% there. So there's still work to do there. And then the partners, so the managing director level, we're at 25%, which is obviously an impact of like only being at 30%, then you're at 25%. So certainly there is still work to be done. The nice thing about one of the statistics that we watch is the revenue producing role. So the front line, and our front line is 43%. So that's not bad in terms of like the frontline jobs. So we still have work to do to hit that target in 4 years. But I think some of the things that are maybe, if I even like get like very tactical on some of the things beyond some of the frame pieces. One, like the tech culture. So we do a lot of technology, a lot of digital, and the tech culture is kind of famous for actually not doing so great. So I think we try to watch that really carefully. Things like events, like networking type events, they need to account for everyone. So they need to be inclusive. They can't just be like the standard networking event where folks are like, just because of certain patterns of working, women sometimes are disadvantaged because they're doing the school runs, et cetera, and not able to do some of that evening networking. So there's an effort on the kind of networking that is there. I think we have a fundamental belief that diversity brings innovation and creativity. And I totally believe that. Because I'm a daughter of an electrical and a chemical engineer and really not that creative. So for opposite reasons, I totally come at data like bottom up. Like you can give me a 2,000 page report and I'm incredibly comfortable, but like the top down super creative stuff, I'm actually horrible at. So I always look at that. I always look for that. And I do believe that diversity is huge, like hugely brings innovation. And I think that that's like something that we just all believe, that we can't be in a situation where we're in like a group think and we're just following one person, because that isn't going to get us to where we need to be for net zero. So I think that helps, where we're always trying to get different views in the room. And then we watch the unconscious bias. So sometimes you just, you know, if there's 18 people in the room and only 1 or 2 women, there will be a bias in the conversation or in the tone or et cetera. And I think we know that word really well, like unconscious bias, making assumptions that shouldn't be made. And I will say at COP26, I was in sessions where there were only 1 or 2 women, which was a total surprise for me because I hadn't been in those kinds of settings in a while. I mean, like Lindsay said, okay, 10 years ago, that was more common than not. And it's not like it's 50% all the time, but 30% is probably reasonable. But I was in a panel, in one of the growth markets panels, and there was only, 2 women out of, 15 people. And that surprised me. I just hadn't been in that room in a while. So, and so I think there is still definitely places and pockets in the industry where we have to do a lot more work, because when you're in that situation, there's a big emphasis in trying to change that dynamic. You have to work a lot harder than in a room where you're like 30%, and then you can, changing that dynamic is a little bit easier than when you're 10% or 20%.
Absolutely. So I'm going to ask the same question to Dominic and Duncan. And I'll start with Dominic and Duncan, I'll start with Duncan and then go to Dominic, so you know that it's coming at you. But it kind of is building on that. You saw in the statistics earlier, and Melissa's just referenced it as well. And I think we've all sort of talked a little bit about it. We're not so bad at the hiring, but my goodness, when we get into that middle management and that executive directors level, we don't quite drop off a cliff, but we certainly are not doing well. So what kind of initiatives or things are you doing as part of the ELC to change that? Because I do think it has to be proactive if we're going to impact that. So Duncan, what are you doing? What kind of programs are you bringing in to make a difference in that middle management and executive roles?
Yeah, it does have to be proactive, and there's a sort of a journey most people go towards a really senior role. And so there's a time period over which people need development, they need support, their talent needs to be focused and stimulated. And I think, just building on that analogy with the safety journey that our industries have been on, there's another element. We did used to have pockets where the safety culture was wrong, and the ways which we tackled it, we put professional expertise in there, safety engineers, and to get us to a point where everybody could be looking after safety. And I think we're doing the same. We're putting professional D&I resource in to give us the capacity to help activate and ignite and educate in many cases, and do it through the line. Again, we found that to get the safety culture and performance up, you need to do it. Many of us work in quite big companies, and we need to use the engine that big companies work on. That is management information. You need to surface it and make it transparent and report on it and talk about it. So it's not just top leaders, and it's not just the way you start the meetings, but it is what people see success through. It's what people enjoy sparring on, and it's what they work on day to day, and activating and igniting all the way down the layers. So it's not just a kind of a few people at grassroots and a couple of visible leaders, that it's done all the way through. So we're investing in that, and a part of it is training, part of it is activation, part of it is our personal visible engagement and commitment to it. And adding to all of that curation of career pathways, mentoring, sponsorship, training, and the networks, giving those networks the resources and support they need, so that much of that career pathway development happens. People help themselves on it as well.
Brilliant. Dominic, same question, but I'm also going to ask, do you include any kind of performance measures for your leadership to show that they're having that positive impact?
Yeah, great question. So maybe I'll just answer the question with a couple of specifics that we found quite useful. So firstly is, if I think about development through an organization, it's encouraging the recognition of diversity as one of the things you're looking at when you promote or in fact recruit. And what I mean by that, we all know it drives business performance, no doubt about that. But actually, you need a critical mass to change a culture in an organization. Yeah. So if you need that critical mass, you've kind of got to start and be a bit proactive and say, we're going to start driving that critical mass to change the culture. So I think for us, it's a discussion around actually valuing diversity in our sort of selection process. We've done a couple of other very tactical things, actually. Is when we write job descriptions, you can actually, and again, this was with the help of Women in Nuclear, you can actually put them through some software that says, how will they be read by sort of different genders? And actually, that gives us a chance to go back and rewrite them so that they are more equitable for sort of males and females. And that really helps. And the final thing that we do is actually, we all know that there tends to have to be a better fit between somebody's view of a role if they're a female in the job description than if you're a male. So part of it is actually going and tapping people on the shoulder, saying, have you thought about applying for this? This could be a good fit for you, and why don't you have a go, and we'll support you. So there's that proactive sort of encouragement as well, sort of throughout the organisation. So there's just some sort of very, very practical things that we found that work for us. I may just, if you allow me, sort of a slight tangent, is to say that I think one of the areas that we do all overlook a little bit, particularly in our industries, is the industrial workforce as well. Because a lot of our conversations tend to be around managerial positions, and you need a completely different set of approaches when you're talking about bringing diversity to all roles and all layers in an organisation. And actually, Hannah, I was quite taken by your link with safety, because we talk a lot about, in safety, don't walk by things that are uncomfortable, call out actions that you don't fit with sort of safety. Exactly the same applies when we're trying to, develop a more inclusive culture. So sorry, a bit of a tangent, but
no, it's good, because I think Lindsay, can I come to you with the same sort of thing? What kind of practical actions are you taking in Scottish Power that not only helps women, but kind of fills that gap, that management and the executive? And for your personal journey, was there any positive things that was done within Scottish Power that really helped, or that you think helped you?
So much like what Dominic's mentioned as well, we've done all the, I don't know, to me they kind of seem obvious, that you make sure the language is inclusive, that you ensure that you've got gender balanced interview panels, which can be a stretch because people are very, very busy, but you have to make sure that they're there. And the fact that there's underrepresentation of women does mean that you could spend your life recruiting, but you have to make that effort, you have to make the time. I think for me as well, there's a degree of challenging what is written down there. So for example, there might be certain presumptions about technical aspects, particularly within engineering roles, and there might even be biases of the recruiting manager because they've seen that job done a certain way historically, or have been with that team and grown up with that team as well, and then have really embedded biases. So I think it's incumbent upon me, not being the engineer in the room, to make those challenges known, and to actually ensure that people feel that there's the opportunity to apply, and maybe reimagine how that job could be done, because there is that leadership piece as well, that how much of it is actually technical, how much of it is leadership. And all of us are perfectly capable, particularly if you are pitching for that level. You're not going to be daft. You're going to have the intellect to be able to ask the right questions and interrogate and understand where the risks are and what remediation is appropriate. So, there is an element of challenging whether those technical attributes are truly required for that leadership role, and if there's strength that can be levered elsewhere in the business and the team. I think the other thing for me is that we also need to make sure that there's challenge laid out about presumption of roles necessarily being full-time. I was delighted to hear Melissa's story about her 18 years of flexible working. That's still quite rare in some of the incumbent utility type organisations. And flexible working is viewed as something that's a business risk, a business threat, that it's viewed as non-value enhancing. But what I've been pleased to see is certainly during my tenure as CEO, we've seen job sharing becoming more prevalent. I've got flexible working as part of my leadership team as well, which previously didn't happen. And that in itself has opened up a talent pool. What I do find though is that those individuals, when they can, and if there is a need to, are incredibly flexible and recognise that there's still a business need to sometimes move their hours around, change how they're working. And I really do appreciate that. And I think that has to be recognised too. But also, as Melissa talked about earlier on, it's opened up a conversation about men taking steps towards flexible working as well. And again, I've got members of my senior management that have come to me because they've got certain requirements, and they've said, right, I wouldn't have asked this before, but is it possible for me to flex my contract? Can I do that? And the culture previously possibly wouldn't have allowed that conversation even to take place, and that individual even to feel confident enough to make that request. So I have seen a real shift in our organisation through some pretty basic steps, which I hope others can emulate quite readily. But it is just that checking, that constant review that you have to go around. being, really focusing on the challenge. And I think one of the things that we've done, and it is featured in the ELC report, is around maternity leave provision when in Scottish Power. And that is something that I recall when I went on my maternity leave 11 years ago now, thinking that doesn't look the best. And I was comparing it to my sister who worked in another energy company, and she seemed to have very different terms and conditions around that. I'm really pleased to see that the business has revised its approach to maternity policy. That was publicly announced. But more than that, we've been working with an organisation called Talent on Leave to coach and mentor and support women going through that journey, because it is pretty daunting, because you're thinking, I've built up my career, I've got credit in the bank, is that going to dissipate the minute I leave to go on mat leave? And you're constantly, and personally I remember that feeling of being torn between motherhood and career, and where was I going to go and what was I going to do. And to an extent, after I was married, I was on baby watch, was very much, and I could feel my career being held back at that point. So I'm really glad that there's been a review of that process, and it is having a positive impact, because statistics like 80% of professional women in the UK who go on mat leave return feeling less confident. That's bonkers. Think of the value that's lost and the energy that's lost in having that negative association with having had a family and then coming back to work. And indeed, if 60% of if they are going to move on in their career, they'll leave the company to do so, because they're obviously feeling that there's some detriment. So there's a talent drain going on there. Heaven forbid they change industry, we want them to stay in energy. But since we've implemented this work with Talent on Leave, and the coaching and mentoring that we've embarked upon, we are seeing really positive feedback, with 80% of those that are receiving this one-on-one coaching experience really feeling that they've got the confidence then to come back and go for promoted posts, and that's then been achieved, which is fantastic. Yeah. There is an awful lot more we could be doing to support women going through those journeys, which was never a conversation before, and I'm really pleased to see it happening now.
That is really good. I'm going to come back to the mention in a few minutes, but there's been a number of things on the chat around this diversity, or the flexibility, and a challenge that's going to be interesting that I'm going to open to particularly Duncan, Dominic, and you. I don't mind which one of you may have an example that you'd like to share with us, but it's how do you really show this flexibility in work style when you're talking about the technical roles, particularly Duncan, when you're talking about bringing people into wind farms, or they're on sort of rotation. Where's the kind of flexibility, or how do you bring that approach to the maybe office-based people?
I don't think there's an easy answer to that. If there's a work pattern that is 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off on a vessel, there are only so many dimensions of flexibility that we can work within. Doesn't mean there's nothing you can do. And I know, I mean, that work pattern is particularly for our operations, also in construction, and we often have the similar sort of pattern. And it's a pretty special sort of person that chooses to work in that marine environment on vessels. Yeah. It's quite a vocation. But one of the things we've found is a sort of delighted, almost surprise in our senior management when they take a risk and put somebody from a totally different background into managing those kind of operations. And bringing somebody who may be a woman, but has got a very different background in management, in commercial skills, perhaps, and actually saying, well, actually, the things you do very well are really what we need in operations management. Yeah. And so it's not just engineering, is what I wanted to say. In that example, Lindsay was giving about an engineering role. We also find the same in operations. So that doesn't answer your question, I realize, about flexible working patterns for certain types of things, but I think it does point towards both engineering and construction, those field type activities, that there is more that can be done.
Yeah, Hannah Mary, you put up your hand. Do you want to?
Yes, I just want to sort of supplement what Duncan has said. I think it's a very hard question, and there is no easy answer. But I want to reflect on how COVID actually has accelerated some of this. So on one of our assets here in the UK, the Mariner oil field, we now have a digital twin of that, which is a digital space within the Aberdeen office, whereby some of these tasks, which you had to go offshore to do inspections at the rig, at the coalface, that can now be done from the control room. And we can do it with a lot of automation and digital technologies. And I think that, you know, that we were forced into doing quite a bit of that, and it accelerated that through COVID. I still think there are roles where you have your shift pattern, you need to be offshore, but more and more, we're seeing more of that digitalization, automation coming in and actually opening up roles that traditionally would have meant that you had to be offshore to fulfill. And the other point I'd like to make on COVID, many of us were thrust into the Teams environment like we are here today. And actually from a D&I perspective, I think that has really helped. We all have the same box. We all have the hand that we put up, whether digital or, you know, physical like I did right now. It doesn't matter your size. It doesn't matter your sort of leaning in at a physical table. It doesn't matter how deep or how forceful your voice is. It has made a level playing field, actually. And I think that the Teams environment and this digital environment that we're now seeing hybrid ways of working, I think that has been great stride forward for D&I. And I look forward to see how we manage to merge that with more physical interface and balance up the two together, because I think it has been a win.
Really good points. And actually, as somebody who runs a technology organization, and we've been champions of the digital twin for about 5 years, it's like, yay, you know, it's really good to see that it's also, as part of this net zero, impacting positively on diversity. I'm going to ask you all the same questions, so I'll work around all of you, so just you can start thinking about it. But what I want to focus on in the last sort of 10 or 15 minutes is things like, what are the remaining barriers that we have, and what needs to be prioritized in the coming year? That's sort of particularly for the ELC, but I think I'd like to hear what you all think about. What are the barriers? What are the actions, invisible leadership, and, you know, for the people we have here listening, what can we do to make a difference in the coming year? Melissa, can I start with you?
I think we mentioned it. I think the middle management part is still that part, like that part of the career, and Lindsay referred to it, where a lot of folks, not just women, but men and women, will get married, will start to have kids. The kids are young. I mean, my kids are now 19 and 15, right? So it's a totally different game from when they were 1 and 2 and 3 and even 11, and you're driving all the time like a taxi driver, you know? So I do think that middle time and the flexibility around that middle management is probably the key barrier. And how can we be really smart and innovative about how we retain them? Because I think that there is something around having women who have gone through it with you. Because I know when there was a time where I looked after the returners, maternity returners, and the first question I could ask that I don't think a male could ask is, what's your childcare situation and how far away is it? That would be the first thing.
Yeah.
Because if somebody was telling me they had to commute 2 hours to go to a nursery, I would be like, okay, don't take that project.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it's the perfect role, because you will have been up at 5, you have run a marathon, and you haven't even started work. So you need to have less than an hour commute, or we need to find you a different project. And that's probably not a conversation that a male would feel comfortable having. And then to Lindsay's point, when she was talking about the confidence, I would be like, but you don't understand, when you become a mom, you develop foresight. That's amazing. Like, you know, when that cup is going to fall, you've got everything in that diaper bag. You got it. Like, that foresight you can apply to work. I'll go into a meeting and I will tell you everything that'll happen, and then we'll walk out and like, we'll just do a debrief. I'm like, you get this like amazing foresight that you have with kids, and you can take that to work. And I wouldn't go around predicting what everybody's doing, but you can, you know, you can harness that, and you come out smarter and able to do more. So don't be less, like, don't feel less. And then the other thing that I would say is, sometimes with the best intentions in the world, the men would be like, oh, she's just back, let's just put her in like some weird office job or whatever. And I'd be like, that's insane. Like, why would you do that? And I'm like, we could job share. That's awesome. Wonderful. Do the job share, keep the challenging role, but don't put her in a box that already says, I think you're going to be less.
Yeah.
So maybe just take this side job. And then how do you come out of that? I'm like, you need to come right back into where you were. And if it's about time, because it is always only about time, actually, it's never about the quality of the work, then we will job share, we come back. I always tell people, come back 3 days and then go up to 4 days. It's hard to come back 4 days and go down to 3 days. Just come back less and then do more, and then go increase. I've done 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4 over my 18 years. And it's been, so I just think there's a few things like that as a woman, you can tell other women, but I think as a man, it's like, how would you feel comfortable saying that? So that middle part, we need to manage that middle part. And then actually the bottom and the top isn't that hard.
Cool. Dominic, what are the kind of things, what are the barriers that you would like to really focus on and overcome in the next year?
Yeah, thank you. So why don't I just talk about one, which was, I think, what I see as our biggest challenge, this came out of this modelling work I mentioned, which actually is recruitment. So we are just above 20% female at the moment. Our intake is just above 20%. And so if you do the maths to get to 40%, it is currently impossible. So we've got to change the recruitment. And I think it's particularly important for us because of the change that the industry is going through, the age demographic that we see in the industry. I think recruitment is a massive challenge. So we are looking at a number of things, but quite frankly, they're not enough yet. So everything from how do we support STEM, so we actually get enough children interested in the roles that would ultimately, but that's a long pipeline. We're looking at saying, well, do we need to go out and recruit for specific skills, or can we train? So this is about fishing from a much bigger pool. So can we bring people in and train? So that's quite interesting. We're looking at academies. I mentioned earlier, we need to throw the geographic net wider. So we don't need to recruit within an hour of each of our offices. Because I think for the professional staff, COVID has helped us there with the sort of working from various locations. The other interesting area is how can we encourage people who are maybe mid-career who are not working? And Melissa, you touched on some of this. Perhaps mothers at home, how can we offer flexibility that actually fits around any commitments they have, whether it's children, people who are maybe carers, so maybe they can't do a full week, or they need to work, hours that aren't the typical 9 to 5. How can we structure our approach so that actually we can put attractive propositions out to people and get them back in who maybe wouldn't otherwise have worked? So yes, I think in summary, one of our biggest challenges, I think, really is the recruitment piece to really move the dial.
Brilliant. Thank you. Duncan, what do you think?
Actually, I found what Melissa said incredibly powerful, and I agree with what that experience just then from Dominic and Cavendish. The way I think we've discussed it in the ELC group, we've done that piece of work, looking at all of the STEM outreach work to try and address that recruitment, to try and address that attraction, and we're all doing an amazing range of different stuff. But we do need to be, I think their conclusions included, for example, we need to be more involved as leaders in it. And also we need to be more structured in it. And there's a lot going on, and it may be a little hit and miss about what's actually working, although we really need it to work a lot better than it does. There's a almost insatiable appetite and need for it, because we need new generations, not just doing what feels familiar to them from their family, from their mothers or fathers, from their part of the communities that they're in. We need people to step outside that history because the future is going to be different. So we need to show that. And I think recognizing that we often, I think Lindsay mentioned it, it's a lot of work to be on all the recruitment panels and all the visible face of this stuff, and you do it for great reasons, and we really appreciate it. But we can't overdraw down on that generosity. So yeah, partly as leaders we have to showcase it, I think. And
Lindsay, what would be your sort of focus for overcoming the barriers, for making a difference in the next 12 months?
I think it's really going to have to be about living it and calling it out, and you know, I am growing the business. I've got money burning a hole in my pocket that I want to invest, and I want to do so with a diverse workforce. And it is about challenging the kind of status quo. I mean, I'm pretty convinced that most of the companies represented on this call today have got reasonably sticky employees. There's not a huge amount of attrition out of our organisation, and that in itself creates a bit of immobility. But it is about, and Melissa's talked very eloquently about the impact of digitalisation and automation on our businesses as well. It's about what opportunity does that open up? What new careers have we not even thought about? And with the growth that net zero brings and the opportunity there as well, we have to do things differently. And with that comes opportunity, and an opportunity to do things in a more diverse and inclusive manner. So I think for me, it's about recognizing where that opportunity is and really tapping into it, and taking everyone else in my leadership team with me on that journey, and making sure that they're also thinking about D&I front of mind, and are, you know, doing the training courses and everything else that I need them to do. In terms of barriers, this is potentially a little bit controversial, and given the targets that we have, you know, we've set ourselves that 33% target, which is fantastic, and I very much hope that we can get there. But 33% to me still doesn't feel like we're winning, because we're 51%. Women are 51% of the population. So 33%, to my mind, we should not be saying job done, pat in the back, off we go. Is there a way of accelerating that 33% to make it happen sooner, because it should be done? And then what's our next one? We need to start that foresighting. You know, we're setting net zero targets out in 2050, 2045 in Scotland. We should be doing the same in gender. We need to have that long-term vision and really create some long-term plans, because this isn't a 2030 issue. It's going to keep going. So we need to do more now.
Totally agree. You know, very supportive of that. Anna Mary, can I come to you? Because I'd like to say, we talked a little bit about mentoring, we've talked about networks. What are the kind of things that you've seen that have currently helped you, or you'd like to challenge back into the group that they could do more in, you know, that would be more helpful? So when we are asking about barriers for the next year, that they could walk away with maybe an idea of, wow, okay, I've thought about recruitment, I've thought about visible leadership, but wow, I didn't think of that. Maybe we need to look at that. So what kind of challenge would you like to put back in? I think would be really helpful for us as somebody who's living this, and how do I get to that middle management and further?
Yeah, so I think for me, this there was a point made about the why and the how of diversity and inclusion, and I want to be a bit controversial. I still think the why is important, because I look at Equinor, and you know, we have a corporate executive committee of 54% women. So we are there, but we still need more work to be done. But I think it comes down to authentic education on this. And I look at an organization like Equinor, 22,000 people, right? There's a big workforce. We need to be doing more to bring people with us on this journey, because I still think there is an element of the unknown, a bit of resisting, a bit perhaps of fear. And I'm not talking about this group or people that have dialed into this call, but we have to challenge ourselves perhaps that we are within a certain echo chamber. And how do we bring the biggest part of our organizations with us? Because, you know, if you increase the accessibility to this, you increase the understanding. And if you can understand something, you can be involved. And when you're involved, you can make a change. And what I want to see in my organization, the team that I lead, is that the biggest part of our organization feels empowered to make the change. And regardless of what gender you are, what background you are, what religion you are, that you realize that the things that are holding the other back are actually holding you back as well. And this is our collective problem. And this takes all of us. And so it starts with all of us. So for me, I really do believe that we're not quite there with the why. And that actually we do need to make sure that everyone is on this journey with us. And that starts with being really authentic and really open and really honest as to why and as to why this matters. Because if we manage to do that in a trustworthy way, I think we're part of the way there.
Excellent. That actually leads me then, we're in the last few minutes. And so we've been talking and challenging the group here about their leadership and visibility and what they could do. I'm going to give you a moment to challenge the audience. So as everybody leaves this particular session, what's the one thing you would ask everybody else? Kind of building on what Hannah Mary has said. We may be the bubble, we may be an echo chamber where we're all kind of believing in this. That's why we're at this event, and that's why we're listening. But what's the one action that some of the people who are listening to this could take on today, the challenge you would give them to go and make a difference in their organization, so that we all become the champions of change? And we don't just ask for it to be the leadership, but it's all of us. So what would be that one thing you say, go out and live this in what way? So Lindsay, I'm going to start with you. What would you challenge our listeners to do?
I'm not so much challenge or potentially a threat. Do you want to be the Kodak? Yeah. Do you want to be the Kodak of the energy sector or any other sector? Those companies that don't embrace D&I are not going to be those that innovate, are not going to be those that go forward, support net zero, are not going to be those that really lead the pack and develop the profitability associated with that. I don't want to be a loser. I'm not sure any others would as well. So there's the reason why is there, and that's been well borne out through academic studies, etc. as well. So, why, and that in itself should give us confidence to talk about it more openly. So yeah, if anyone comes across any doubt, push back on it and talk about why, and show them how easily it can be done.
Super. Melissa, what would you say to the audience?
Sorry, I was having problems getting off mute. I would say when you're in a meeting room, to look for the youngest woman in the room, the youngest one, and ask for her opinion, so that she gets used to speaking in a room out loud, which I generally do anyway, because I think the young people have like amazing kind of out of the box views. But I do think just calling them out is good. It's good practice for them and for us. So when you're in a room, look for that person that's quiet and ask what their opinion is. And many times that'll be a young woman.
Thank you. Dominic, what would you suggest to the audience?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe just come back to something we mentioned right at the beginning, which was networks. And so I think as we're going through a change over the next few years, networks and peer support are two things that I hear are really, really valuable. And there's a role for us as leaders to enable that. And there's also a role for people to reach out to their peers and colleagues, etc., and build those networks. So that would be my one ask is to help us with that.
Excellent. Duncan?
I would say, tell as many people as you can how much fun and how rewarding it is to work in this sector.
Yeah.
Share it. Share the good news and that it's attractive and that you get a lot out of it. And you will hopefully attract like-minded people. They'll be inspired by you.
Super. Hannah Mary?
Pay it forward. So use your time to elevate others and to speak up for them when they're not in the room. As leaders, we should always be doing that, but use it to not promote yourself, but to promote the quietest one, like Melissa said. Give them the space and give them the platform that they fully deserve.
I think that's the best visible leadership we could provide. So I'm going to finish on that. I'm going to thank the panelists. I think it's been really, really interesting. We've had a load of commentary in the chat as people have gone on. I hope you have inspired. I hope we've challenged. I hope we've certainly given people food for thought. So thank you very much. We now have a 10-minute break. So if everybody could be back at 12:55, that would be awesome. Thank you so much to the panelists. Goodbye. Thanks.
Well, a very good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you've had the chance to grab a quick sandwich. This is our final session for today. My name is Nick Waith. I'm the Chief Executive of the Energy Institute and a board member of Powerful Women. And I'm delighted to introduce our next panel. Hopefully online, I should be joined right now by Elaine Smith from the Oil and Gas Authority. Good afternoon, Elaine. Rachel Fletcher from Octopus Energy, and Adrienne Kelby, who's joining us, and Adrienne leads her own business. I'll introduce each of the speakers properly in a moment, but we're going to talk about the role of the regulator in driving the D&I agenda, and it's a fantastic panel to have. Unfortunately, our proposed speaker from Ofgem has been unable to join us due to sickness, so we wish her a speedy recovery. So let me introduce the speakers one by one. I'm going to ask them just to say a few words of introduction and just share some of their own perspectives and their journeys through this. I'm going to start with Rachel. Good afternoon, Rachel. It's great to see you. Rachel is the Director of Regulation and Economics at Octopus Energy. Prior to that, Rachel was the CEO of Ofwat, so comes with a very strong regulatory background. Prior to that, spent 12 years at Ofgem and has a BA in economics and an MPhil in economics and politics from Cambridge. Rachel, great to have you with us. Could you say about your own journey?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much for the invitation, Nick, and really, really great to be speaking to you all today. Yeah, I mean, my journey, well, I come from a long line of women who were never going to be satisfied with, sorry, is the background noise around me, is this interrupting you?
You hear a little bit, but you carry on, we can't hear you.
Yeah, it's okay, it's just I'm afraid I'm in a conference centre right now.
So. Table tennis.
Anyway. Yeah, there is, yeah, it's quite distracting, sorry about that. So I come from a long line of women who were never going to be happy just doing the stay-at-home roles that women have traditionally been assigned. And, you know, to the extent that certainly my grandmother, who didn't have the opportunities to have a career, really actually her mental health suffered very, very significantly, I think, from being frustrated and not being able to have the kind of career that she really wanted. So I think my starting point actually is a personal one and is about individuals' fulfillment in life, and a real recognition, certainly for me, that as a child of the 60s, never to take for granted the opportunities which I certainly have had, you know, to go to university, to have a career, and indeed to have a career and combine that with bringing up children as well. So that's a sort of background. I think having said that, even my own experience, I think when I was pregnant with my first child, I was working in consulting at the time, and I very vividly remember being asked, was I going to give up my job? With the assumption being that it would be bad for my child if I continued to work. You know, and even, you know, fast forward to the early 2000s, where by that point I was in Ofgem in the public sector, famous for being brilliant at the inclusion and diversity and ahead of the game. You know, it was frowned upon actually to leave work early to deal with the childminder timetable, and I certainly didn't have the confidence to say, I'm afraid I can't make that meeting because I need to be back home to pick my kids up. So I think you know, I see huge strides in my lifetime. A part of me cheers every time I hear about a male colleague taking paternity leave, you know, or when somebody is completely confident to say, I'm sorry, I can't do that because I've got this responsibility. But I think we all know we've not come far enough. You know, I always say, actually, if we're not getting equality of opportunity for women right, we're missing even the low-hanging fruit, because, you know, frankly, we've now had many generations of women with great education opportunities. And of course, diversity is much broader than just gender diversity, We've got lots of other interests and perspectives and attributes that we need to be properly representing in the workforce. Just in terms of closing from me, by way of a lot of those reflections were personal, about my own personal experience. But I think actually for me, this agenda is business critical. So this is not just about doing the right thing for people, but I actually think that, you know, whether we're in the energy industry or in any other sector, if you're not taking diversity and inclusion really seriously, then you're going to be failing to tap into talent, you're going to be failing to connect with customers, and you're going to be failing to make the shifts to sustainability and sustainable business models that we all need. So, you know, that's the arc, my background, my own lived experience, but also why this isn't just about helping us all live better lives. It's business critical, absolutely central, essentially, especially in the energy sector and facing up to the challenges associated with net zero.
Fabulous. Thank you for those opening comments, Rachel. I love the comment about men taking paternity leave. It's a personal passion and mission of mine. And I'm also struck by describing gender as the low-hanging fruit. It certainly doesn't feel like that in terms of the rate of progress, but I think you're spot on. If we can't get this right in gender, it's going to be much harder to get it right in other dimensions. Adrienne, you're in New Zealand. It is 2 a.m. Thank you. You've gone above and beyond for joining us at this. I don't know whether to describe it as morning or late at night, but thank you for being up with us so late. Adrienne, I know you ran your own coaching and advisory business, but prior to that, you were the chief executive of ONR, which is the nuclear regulator. So looking forward to hearing some of those perspectives. I know you've got quite a strong portfolio career of other non-exec roles that you currently do, and previously have acted as a powerful women agenda. Perhaps, Ambassador, perhaps you could share a few of your personal perspectives.
Well, I have a really different background from Rachel. I'm always fascinated to listen into how people got where they are, because in truth, if you ask me, I still don't know. It's still a miracle every day I wake up and wonder quite what's going to come onto the agenda. But for me, I actually started as a PA. I left college after 1 year because I found it kind of dull, and I went to work, and that was me at 18, and I have worked ever since. I've been a PA, I've been a trainer, I've been an operations manager, I've been a training coordinator, a fundraiser. I've given money away through lottery good causes and set up all kinds of systems for that. And then moved on to a local authority and to safeguarding. I led the merger of the Criminal Records Bureau, for example, to become the DBS. If any of you have your certificate, I hope you're still getting it nice and quick. That system I put in should still be standing up well. And then I moved on to the Office for Nuclear Regulation. So I think it's fair to say that I have got a bit of an eclectic career. And it's really been founded on one thing that's gone through the middle of it, and one thing alone that really binds this collection of jobs. And it's just that I really, really like helping people be better than they came in, and that includes myself. And I think a growth mindset and a growth agenda is really a key part of DE&I agenda. I didn't really know so much about the terminology that we use these days until quite recently. But I can tell you that in my 20s, when I was working with women returners, as they were then labelled, people coming back as a trainer, I couldn't figure out what was wrong with employers. And I was a bit stroppier then than I am now. And I worked in an area called Castlemilk, which there's a few Scottish accents on the panels already today, but it is a giant housing scheme that was at the time very poor. And I was pretty peed off, frankly, that people were not taking my excellent trainees who had worked really, really hard. So I started going around and talking to them and just saying, what's the issue? And really, when I look back now, the issue was exclusion. It wasn't skill, it wasn't really experience, it was snobbery, actually. And it was a fear factor about taking on people who had a different background. Now, I didn't put up with it then, and I certainly don't put up with it now. For me, the journey of inclusion has come more and more And I spent 15 years working alongside the voluntary sector, trying to target grants to the areas that needed it most. Introduced £300 small grants programme because my heart was there, not in the 50 million quid Millennium Dome or whatever else. And as I've seen it more recently, I would say, in the nuclear sector, 5.5 years at the head of ONR, an excellent regulator, if I may say so, but really coming into a sector which was only about 22% women, and recognizing very quickly that that was an issue. So I've also been two-time patron of Women in Nuclear, which was really set up to promote the message about diversity and inclusion. Yes, for women, but yes, for everybody. And we've heard a couple of references today to the nuclear sector deal targets around gender inclusion. I can tell you that I struggled with that. I was at the table at the Nuclear Industry Council, really coming to the decision that targets were needed. And that was head over heart all day long, because I believe if we run industries in the way that we ought to, with an ethical approach to helping others be their best selves, then we shouldn't need targets. So that was a wake-up call in it, but I'm glad they set them, because we've heard the discussion today really ramp up. So my bag on DEI is very simple. It's not a side dish, it's a main dish. And it's not just for the board table, it's for every table. And that's really my passion in being here today at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Good for you, and thank you. And that's been a common theme across today, about having it core and not just something that is done by the D&I lead or the HR person. So thank you for repeating that. Elaine, good afternoon to you. Elaine, you're joining us today from OGA. I know that you have been without power the last few days, so I hope everything is okay with you and your family, and thank you for being here. Elaine, you've had a really interesting career as well. You're currently the D&I and business partner lead at OGA, the Oil and Gas Authority. Prior to that, you were head of HR at a chartered accounting firm, and have had a really sort of interesting background in that whole space. Perhaps you could share a few perspectives on your personal journey and how it links to D&I.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks very much for having me today. Unfortunately, still no power, but I've got a backup plan. So really delighted to be here today. So my background is in HR. I've been working in HR for about 20 years now. So I guess I'm fortunate or unfortunate enough to have seen examples of some great practices and some really not so great practices. So interestingly, as you say, before I joined the OGA, I worked in professional practice, and I would actually say in professional services, I beg your pardon. And I suppose my experience there is that there's some similar challenges, I think, compared to the energy sector. I was involved in the first lot of gender pay gap reporting for that organisation that I was working for. And certainly what came through there was that there was an awful lot of occupational segregation in professional services. And, perhaps it's not quite the same in the energy sector, but I think that for me was a real it highlighted that there was some key areas where organisations really needed to work. And I think from our work with industry, which I'll come on to discuss later, a lot of them have seen the gender pay gap reporting process as being quite a pinnacle point for them to help really highlight the areas where they really, really needed to work and buck up their ideas a little bit. So there's that side of things. As I say, my background is in HR. So I suppose HR itself tends to be more female dominated more than anything else. And I think my experience there is that also brings a number of challenges. So ability to, obviously in HR, you're trying to influence, negotiate, and try and influence a lot of practice. And sometimes that can be especially hard if you're dealing with a board of entirely males or what have you. I've certainly found that a challenge over the years. So I've felt that personally. And I suppose through that experience, it's now my mission, as the other panelists have also said, to make it better for other people, to make people feel included, to make people feel that they have a voice. I would go beyond gender and say that there's also, a personality side of things as well, whether it's insights or Belbin and things like that. you know, to kind of make sure that those who are more blue-minded, I'm a bit more like that myself, who are more thinkers and reflectors, you know, that makes some situations really difficult, because being able to think on the spot, I'm really challenging myself today, I should say, being on a panel where I'm not quite sure where the direction of travel is going. But it's really important to understand those differences in people. So yes, we need to look at gender, and absolutely there's such a big journey there, but I think there's another side of things to kind of make sure, how do we make sure that people feel included regardless of their personality type, regardless of anything like that, to make sure they've always got a voice in the room. So I suppose that's my mission now. And I say I'm lucky now at the OGA to actually have inclusion as part of my role, and it's an internal and an external side of things that I'm involved at the OGA. So I guess what I would close on and say it's my personal mission to make sure that everybody gets a voice in the room at all opportunities, and I hope that I can be a real part of their journey in doing that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Elaine, and I do hope you get your power back. I'm struck by that point you made about the insights, and actually from personal experience, you know, I have found I probably have far more of a, you know, interaction commonality with a you know, a female person of color who is the same insight colors as me than I do a male who looks and looks like me. So I think that's a really interesting perspective you bring there, that this is not all about getting people with the same behavioral tendencies as us. Let me stick with you if I can, Elaine, whilst we've got you on camera. So you're at the OGA. Can you just talk us through the OGA's agenda around D&I? We're delighted that Andy Samuel has recently joined the Energy Leaders Coalition. What is OGA doing around D&I right now?
So thank you for asking. So I think probably where I would start there is that the OGA's approach is not to take a really sort of hard regulatory stick in this area, and that the approach is very much around engaging, listening, supporting. So, but that said, you know, the risk to the industry of the threat, we're very aware of the threat to industry of not listening and taking action in this area. So, but it's very much on the listening, engaging, facilitating side of things. But a good quote that I picked up actually from the recent annual report from Powerful Women is about, when something's good, it starts in excellent leadership. And I think that's really where the OGA has taken, you know, a key step there. It's got to start with us. So we could put out as much guidance or as many instructions as we like, but if we're not doing it ourselves, then what's the point? So absolutely has to start with us. So we've had quite a journey at the OGA. We are quite a small organisation compared to many of the operators that we deal with. And, you know, our split at the moment, we're about 45% female and 55% male, but we've got a really good distribution of women in our leadership and board as well. So we're hoping that we're having a really good journey from that side of things. When we first were formed, we had 28% women. So we've had quite a journey, but, you know, stats alone aren't all. So in terms of what we're doing ourselves, so we're a member of Powerful Women, like say Andy's on the Energy Leader Coalition board. We've signed up to the Access Pledge. We are also involved in the OG UK D&I task force as well, which has been set up to really try and support, provide resources and help industry along the way. We've also, in 2021, we set up an ESG task force, because given the shifting landscape, investor confidence is really, really important. And as part of that, a cross-industry task force was created to come up with some guidelines for ESG as well. So that's a really important side of things. In terms of other practical things that we've done, this year we published our second inclusion report. So our first inclusion report was in 2020. And that set out what we were planning to do ourselves. So it was reasonably detailed, had key areas where we wanted to improve, and also contained our asks of industry as well. So we're really delighted. We thought we need to put something out into the public domain that shows we're committed and the actions that we're going to be taking as well. And we're going to report on this annually to show that we're taking this seriously. And really delighted that a couple of the bigger operators are following suit. BP, for example, has also published something similar. Obviously, your Energy Leaders Coalition, it's great to see those commitments there, but to see a more detailed report with breakdowns of actions and key things that people are actually doing is absolutely fantastic to see. It also helps the smaller operators and service companies start to look at what the bigger operators are doing. And finally, but I would actually say most importantly, engaging with industry externally. We're now starting to bring small groups of operators and service companies together in small working groups to discuss the good practices that they have in place, have honest discussions about where they're struggling. And so we've now had 2 of these meetings. We're about to have another one again soon. And it's been really heartening to see the real support for one another. You could say, many times people are competing against one another, but in these sessions that we've been holding, there's a real support for one another in terms of, well, we've tried this, we're struggling here. Oh, how about trying this or trying this and all the rest of it. So these sessions have been absolutely brilliant, and we're hoping that through these sessions that we will be able to then produce our own case studies in our next inclusion report in 2022 to show the really good stuff that's happening in industry and make it as visual as possible. Because whilst we've got a huge journey to go on, a lot of the good practices aren't really getting out there. So we really want to assist along that journey.
Brilliant. It's great to hear all the things happening at OGA, and very pleased to have you as members of Powerful Women. You use the term, Elaine, a hard stick, and that you're not waving it around. But I guess if we sort of think about the progress we're making as the energy sector, whilst there has been progress, it really isn't moving nearly as fast as it needs to. And so I'd like to sort of ask the question of all of you, and I'm going to start with Rachel. At what point should the regulator step in and take action and potentially sanction companies who are not delivering on their gender and other forms of diversity targets? Rachel, we've lost you on the screen, so I'm hoping you're still there. If not, we'll come back to you in a minute. But Rachel, I think you bring a really interesting perspective, because you've come from the regulator. You've sort of gone from being gamekeeper to poacher, if I may use that rather unfair analogy. But how do you feel from a perspective of a company as to when the regulator should wave that hard stick?
Yeah, I am here. Hopefully you can hear me, even if my interconnection isn't good enough to see me. I also feel quite squeamish, actually, I must say, about the regulator stepping in directly and setting targets on diversity and inclusion. And I think a lot of what Elaine has been talking about really resonates with me. A couple of things, for example, that we did in Ofwat, was actually putting a massive focus on the board setting the purpose of the company, and therefore also taking ownership for creating the culture that was needed to deliver on a public purpose mission in the water companies. And I think that sort of approach, I mean, it's quite an oblique approach, if you like, but going back to what we've all said, I don't think companies in the public utility sector can actually achieve their full social purpose unless they are really driving a diversity and inclusion agenda. And I think it's important that we focus as regulators, as I was, on the outcomes as opposed to inputs or even indeed intermediate inputs. And I think a lot of the tools like leading by example that Elaine's been talking about creating forums where the challenges of diversity and inclusion can be discussed in the industry, and being absolutely ambitious on the outcomes, whether that's decarbonisation, whether that's customer satisfaction, whether that's innovation, really focusing on those outcomes and making sure that there's no compromise there. I think all of these things will drive and should drive a diversity and inclusion agenda And I think that's a better, more holistic approach than having regulatory set targets that then just become tick boxes, frankly. And people are only doing it because the regulator has asked them to do it, rather than, if you like, making their own way to realizing that this is absolutely vital for their success in the framework that the regulator has set.
Thank you, Rachel. And we heard that all perfectly fine. So that came across well. Adrienne, so, I mean, you mentioned in your role, and it's been talked about previously today, about the nuclear sector deal targeting 40% women. You said clearly it wasn't an easy thing to achieve. Can you talk about how you achieved that, how you brought the industry with you, and as a regulator, you know, how hard that stick, you know, should be pushed if people don't deliver against those targets?
So I think the first thing I would say is that regulators serve the public. However, they regulate within the scope of the legislation set out for them by government. And I can't think of a single regulator that has a DE&I scope specifically. I may be wrong, but I can't think of one, and I'm talking globally. So for me, there's something about stepping back to the big why, as we said earlier. Why do we care about DE&I? It's the right thing to do, but who cares, frankly? So, you know, for me, I step back and I say, well, if DEI is fundamentally good for psychological safety, then psychological safety is bloody marvelous for safety culture. Therefore, these things are connected. Now, bear in mind, regulators may be financial, they may be economic, they may be safety. I have a safety bias, as you know, but I speak, you know, more broadly about that. So for me, what's important about DEI from a regulatory perspective is that when you have a culture of belonging, real belonging, not tick box crap, I'm not interested in that, real belonging, then people are more likely to bring their research and innovation game. Well, if you're an economic regulator, you're going to love that because that's going to improve cost efficiency and improve opportunistic development by the companies that you regulate. But it's also fundamentally going to improve the psychological safety for people to speak out where there are matters, especially safety matters. Look at Piper Alpha. You know, look at the disasters that hit the Wall Street, you know, financial crisis, many of which were culturally driven. So for me, I'd probably be a bit provocative here and say, I think DE&I should be perceived as a safety issue. I think it can be perceived as a safety issue, and I think it could be regulated more strongly as a safety issue. This is not to criticize, as I say, the current crop of safety regulators in all the sectors across the globe. But I believe if we framed DE&I in a more strategic safety context, we would take a different action. And for me, you know, I go back to that kind of slightly eclectic career, as I said earlier, that I've had. I remember being told that the number one enemy I had in any training room was groupthink. And that was as a trainer, trying to teach folks something new, trying to teach myself something new every time. I can categorically assure you, groupthink is your number one enemy in both research and innovation and in raising issues in safety. And again, what does DEI do to groupthink? It smashes it over the head. It is the thing with the big stick, not us as regulators. So I think we could go further. I'm being provocative. I think we should go further. That's me as a consumer. But I absolutely know that the frame of DE&I needs to be about the big why if we want to make the difference. And I fundamentally believe that we can.
Some great quotes, Adrienne, which no doubt will hit social media later. And this has been a big theme of today, of this linkage to the sort of safety agenda, which many of us know very well from over decades in the energy sector. Let's bring in Elaine again, and you talked very powerfully earlier about all the things that OGA is doing. To ask you the direct question, at what point does this go from a sort of a nice, safe conversation about good practice to potentially OGA wielding that regulatory stick at the operators in the sector?
Well, I think from what we're seeing so far, the engagement that we've experienced has been really great and really heartening to see. So certainly we will be continuing on this journey at the moment. I think from a wider perspective, from us publishing and operators and service companies themselves choosing to put out into the public domain what it is that they are doing, they're putting out a proposition there for any talent that they want to be attracting to the sector to make a choice as to whether or not that's somewhere where they can visualize themselves working. So I think, yes, you can take the regulatory side of things, but I think ultimately those companies, if they don't get with the programme, for want of a better phrase, then their ability to attract that best talent will be lost. And ultimately they will be the ones who will lose out. So there is a choice there. You know, we have a big problem with attracting talent to the sector for lots of different reasons. So if you add in there, not communicating and being really clear that your workplace is open, it's inclusive, and it's somewhere where you can feel welcomed, where you'll have a voice in the room, coming back to my favorite quote, then people will not choose to join you. And therefore, how can you possibly meet those that net zero journey? You can't do that. We can only do that by attracting the best talent. So we will continue on this journey of encouraging people to share their practices, to put them out there. And, you know, like I say, we're seeing some really, really encouraging messages. So we're not seeing anything so far that requires us to go down that line. We do obviously have other meetings that we have with our operators on how they're doing in other areas. So there could be ways and means potentially where that could be toughened, but certainly at the moment we're seeing some really good signs, and we would hope that, say, the more people that are in that space who are sharing what they're doing will make it very difficult for those on the sidelines who aren't getting with the programme to not join. But I would always want them to join it for the right reasons. And ultimately, it does come down to talent and creating that. I mean, I love psychological safety is really big in my eyes as well. You need to sort of have that space. And to me, it's like a product. It's, you know, when we're attracting talent in, they'll be assessing lots of different things. And one of those will be whether or not they feel welcome, safe, and included in what's happening. So I would hope that that will be enough. I will maybe be taken to task on that in time, but I don't think there is a choice. I would always want people to do it for the right reasons. And if it needs to be revisited, then so be it. But I think we continue on this journey at the moment.
And there's some great comments, by the way, coming through on the chat. So I'd encourage those of you following just to have a quick look at that, sort of really complementing some of the points. So from your perspective, Elaine, there's sort of you know, continuing that sort of approach. You've made this really powerful point that if you don't get with the program, you're ultimately not going to be successful as a company. It still strikes me as incredible that nearly a third of the companies in the UK in energy don't have any female representation on their boards. And you know, so whilst we make that assertion, those companies have yet to go out of business. So I'm going to just keep this alive slightly. I mean, Adrienne, you took a slightly sort of tougher approach. I would love to have known whether you would have said that as when you were in the role of regulator, and you can come back and answer that one if you'd like to. So just opening it up to Adrienne or Rachel, you know, at what point does this sort of, you know, encouraging people to come along the journey, to get on the, you know, get on with the program, at what point do you say, well, okay, it's not working fast enough?
I mean, Nick, you asked me the question about the nuclear sector deal, which I've failed to respond to. And to be clear, I didn't do that in my role in ONR per se. That was as part of the Nuclear Industry Council, which was government and energy sector led. However, the decision to set some kind of targets within the nuclear sector deal, and to be clear, it is completely unique. Of all of the deals, it is the only one that speaks to anything actually about inclusion. It came hard. I'm not a stick person. You know, it's not fun to catch people getting things wrong. It's fun to catch them getting it right. But you know what? I go back to a very stupid young me. Obviously, long before I was ever in safety regulation, I didn't used to wear a seatbelt. I wore a seatbelt because it became unpalatable not to, and it was made unlawful. All of the persuasion about wearing a seatbelt absolutely washed over me. Now, I hang my head in shame. Please don't judge me. I have grown up since then. However, sometimes You need to be tilt, as we would say in Scotland. And I think this sense of, I suppose it's a question I would throw back. How much longer do we want to keep pointing out that we're right and waiting for everybody else to do something? My concern about the doing is that the action plans and the policies and the processes aren't the problem. It is fundamentally a problem of cultural role modeling and leadership. And that is what we need to compel companies to take account of when they hire. If they get that right, a lot of the other things will change. But my concern is that we still see across many sectors, technical prowess hired and promoted over and above so-called soft skills. That is unacceptable these days. And I don't see enough action being taken on that. So I'd come back the full circle to how do you make it actually an advantage? But I completely understand there's a careful role for regulators, which is set in legislation. They shouldn't be wandering off looking at things that seem vaguely interesting. But if not the regulators, then who? It sure ain't the stakeholders at the moment, as from what I can see. Maybe as stakeholders and as shareholders and as pension holders, we can step up in that regard as well and hold the companies in which we have interest to account. That would be another way of doing it. And we all have that power.
Absolutely. I'll invite Rachel, if you'd like to come back in on that and respond to any of Adrian's points or indeed Elaine's points.
I mean, I've got a lot of sympathy with where you're taking this conversation, Nick, and I think there's a bit of a chicken and an egg. I think the seatbelt analogy is a good one. I think though, and there could be a point, right, where maybe Ofgem should be stepping in and at some point trying to use, to the extent it can, use its powers to drive this agenda. But I come back, my experience, having been in regulation for a long time, is that quite often when something becomes a regulatory obligation, there is a risk that companies disengage brain, and this becomes a question of compliance and keeping the regulator happy. And I think we're all in violent agreement here that actually the D&I agenda is not about keeping the regulator happy. It's not even about keeping your stakeholders happy or looking good, whether that be to shareholders or customers. It's fundamentally about changing the culture of the business. So dare I say it, you may have women on your board and actually not yet being creating that inclusive culture where either women feel that they've got the opportunity to speak out, where they feel they've got a different view, or indeed where those women have been hired because they don't have a different view and they're going to fall in line. So there's a real conundrum here, which is why I was really pleased with Ofwat's focus on the culture of the companies and holding boards to task about what are they doing to create a culture in the company that will deliver on that company's social purpose. And I think that sort of puts the challenge back on the board, not to put the number of women in or people from different socioeconomic backgrounds that the regulator has prescribed, but to think hard and deep, exactly as Adrian and others are saying, about who is it that they're hiring and what are their asks when they're looking at candidates. What kind of inclusive culture are they creating, not just in the boardroom, but in the canteen or in the day-to-day operational meetings? And how safe is it, for someone to raise concerns or to bring new ideas or different perspectives? So I kind of, maybe at some point, as I said, there's a need for the regulator just to kind of force the pace on this. But I think that would only that could only ever be the beginning of what needs to happen in companies. It can never really be the end. And that's the challenge with a regulatory intervention, is that it ends up just looking too much like a quick fix, as opposed to the systemic impact that we're really looking for D&I to have in these sectors.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll just invite Elaine if you've got anything to respond to in the points that have been made.
Yeah, agree with everything that's been said. It's a tricky balance, but ultimately, it's about getting with the program, as I keep saying, and doing things for the right reasons, creating the right culture at all levels. It is obviously very important at your leadership and your board levels where decisions are being made, but really thinking deeply about practices. And something actually really interesting that's come up as part of these meetings that I was referencing earlier on is really finding the opportunity for D&I in everything that we do, even when it comes to difficult things like reorganizations, for example. Let's not let D&I be a casualty of COVID. Let's really think about those opportunities that this gives us. The time should have been, let's face it, a long time ago, but the time is certainly now. There's so much change happening. We've experienced so much difference and opportunity for D&I over the last, it feels like decades, and when it comes to COVID, but certainly the last 18 months, we've experienced a lot of change. There's so much opportunity there to change things up. And I think if anything, maybe this could give us the green light for some companies to actually accelerate where at, things like flexible working practices, for example, working styles, just how people work and interact together. So I think actually now is a real opportunity for companies to grasp change, because sometimes making that wide scale change just on a gradual pace is quite difficult, but now we've really got that chance. So I really, really hope that companies do embrace the good stuff that we've managed to put in place as a result of what's been a horrific situation. But maybe it could turn into something positive for us all going forward.
Thank you, Elaine. So I'm going to pivot the conversation towards customers, and we've talked quite a lot about customers today. Rachel, you currently work with a very customer-centric energy company at Octopus. Your previous regulatory experiences at Ofgem and Ofwat were also very sort of customer-centric sort of regulatory bodies. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the importance of sort of representing consumers and all the diversity they bring in terms of what we're trying to achieve in the energy transition?
Oh yeah, where to start? I mean, obviously in Octopus, we are driving a revolution. I don't think there's I don't think that's over exaggerating things in the way that the energy system works. And I think many of us know that with a decarbonized energy system, the amazing opportunity we have to tap into the flexibility that will come as we adopt electric vehicles, electric heating, and so on and so forth. And the opportunity actually to decarbonize more quickly and more cheaply through tapping into that flexibility and encouraging people to use energy when it's cheap and green and plentiful, and avoid using it at times when the wind might not be blowing or the network is already under considerable stress. And actually what that revolution means actually is harnessing the power and individual actions of our customers. So our customers stop being just the recipients of our bills and hopefully the people that pay them on time. They start becoming this real engine of a flexible, decarbonized energy system. But we're asking really big shifts from people to deliver on that vision. We're asking them to put new technology in their homes. We're asking them to use energy differently, perhaps to be exposed to times when energy prices are very high during the day, and others when actually they might get paid for using energy. And I think we can only really bring customers with us on that really big journey if we've got a trusted relationship with them. So this is the D&I punchline, right? I mean, you build trusted relationships with customers by giving them great customer service and by understanding what it is that they need and providing them with what they need, realizing that none of us falls neatly into any individual customer category, that we're all unique individuals. So that importance then, I think, of energy retailers in particular, having the connection with their customer, having built that up through empathy, through real contact points, being a genuine human when interacting with customers, not a robot. You know, all of that can really be enhanced if the company itself is very strong on diversity and inclusion, and is bringing people who have got the different life experiences to connect with different people in different circumstances. The other dimension actually is on the inclusion agenda is the feedback loop. So one of the things I love, I'm still very new to Octopus, but one of the things I love seeing in Octopus is that the people that are on the front line talking to customers every day have got a very, very clear channel to communicate right back to the center where decisions are being made about our tech platform, how it works, about how we're treating customers in certain situations or where the problems lie. And we're using Slack for that. You know, people going online onto the Slack channel and saying, hey, I've got a customer with this problem, I'm not quite sure how we fix it. Or that email we sent out yesterday, I've spoken to 5 people today who didn't really understand it, and I think we could do better. We need to go away and rephrase it. And that's inclusion working, right? We've got, you know, frankly, probably some of the least well-paid people in Octopus, you know, but who are gathering every day absolutely vital information to allow us to give better service, to communicate better, to improve the experience of our customers. And that engine really, I think, is going to be the secret to our success, you know, if we're going to go on this journey and get customers to become part of that smart, flexible energy system of the future. So this diversity and inclusion piece, it's got multiple facets to it. It's not just about who Octopus is hiring, but also how we are using the intelligence from talking to our customers and how that intelligence then is shaping the organization that we are and the offering that we can give our customers.
I love the focus on the customer and how fundamental you see it to your success. We all know that energy is not the most customer-centric industry. You are on one extreme of that. I'm guessing, you know, one could argue that the nuclear industry and the oil and gas industries are probably sort of towards the other end of that spectrum. So, I mean, from your perspective, Adrienne, in terms of how you thought about the end consumer of those nuclear generated electrons, how would you respond to that sort of the importance of engaging individual consumers and society more broadly in this debate?
I said earlier that regulators serve the public. I feel very strongly about that. ONR has been on quite a journey in engagement there. It's not always easy. I think nuclear brings out specific emotional responses from people, very pro, very anti, and we are, you know, neither. As regulators, we need to be completely independent of that. But I think when it comes to representing an organization in an appropriate way, it does come down to integrity. And that for me is hugely connected again to inclusion and belonging. You know, to have a staff team with the confidence to go and speak to people who'd be very angry about us permissioning new nuclear reactors potentially, and know that we have their back, but also that we'll give them the skills to do that, which are different to the technical skills of doing the job, is key. So I think there is something about the courage to have conversations that are difficult, which exist with stakeholder groups as well as internally about difficult things. Calling it out is a couple of comments on that I've seen. But I think fundamentally positioning the organisation so that the brand proposition, and that sounds a bit odd for a regulator to talk in that terms, but it can't be annual reports and websites full of pictures of nuclear sites. They're now full of pictures of people, because that's what a regulator is. It's not a nuclear building. It's not even an office. It's certainly not after COVID. We show our people, and to do that, if your people aren't particularly diverse and they don't look like your consumer base, it becomes very obvious. So, for me, engaging in not just face-to-face, but just opening things up to be less mystical, more plain English, more easy access to information that people would want, and trying to preempt that rather than waiting for FOIs, is actually a part of good regulatory practice. And that's a whole team sport. That's not just a comms team. That's everybody needs to be involved in doing that. So, things like the BBC's 50/50 project, one of the last things that we signed up to when I was with ONR, where we've made a promise, a commitment that in all of our imagery, we will show men and women 50/50. If you look back 5 years ago, it will look very different. So again, it's back to the role modeling, living with integrity, showing that you do what you say you'll do, and engaging with groups internally and externally who will have different views from you. That is no different a groupthink challenge than it is to hire people who look the same as you. So it's a different, I think, consumer model, perhaps, in nuclear regulation. I think the last thing I'd say is what's come up in a number of these conversations is this notion of supporting future generations. And I love the fact that regulators are now involved in things like STEM, as ambassadors. They're involved even as powerful women ambassadors. We're on women in nuclear and women in engineering and all sorts of things. And I think that's wonderful. I think to step away from some of the constraints that I think some previous generational leaders felt it's not the regulator's place. It bloody is the regulator's place to lead by example. And I think now regulators are doing that more than ever.
Thank you. Some fantastic comments there. And let's go to Elaine. And again, I joined this industry in the North Sea, oil and gas. To me, one of the things that I loved was the fact that a gas pipeline going all the way out to the North Sea connected eventually to somebody's home. I don't think most consumers think like that, though. I'm an engineer, so that's my mind. I'm probably not sort of typical of most consumers. So could you share, Elaine, how you think of the role of consumers from an OGA perspective?
Yeah, I really agree with everything that Adrienne has just said there. It's difficult, isn't it? Because let's face it, the perception of the industry on media isn't always the best, and there's been a lot of debate, obviously, with COP26, and it's put an awful lot of stuff out there, which will be helpful in some ways for the industry, but not in others. So I think it's really important, as Adrienne says, you have to reflect your customer base. So kind of going back to my point earlier on about, creating the right environments to attract the right talent, different types of talent, I mentioned early on about the personalities and things like that as well. So attracting a diverse talent in is definitely the right way to go. We need to make sure that where things don't go right in industry, that there's an acceptance of that, and that there's, because it's not always going to go right, and the industry is encouraged to put it out there and make things right. And I think, that needs to be public. It needs to sort of be accepted that it's not always going to go in the right direction. I think as well, as far as the regulator's role goes, we'll continue with these discussions to kind of make sure that the good practices are shared and that industry are encouraged to make those good practices public. And really hooking in with those different external networks that can give them support. And with things like the OG UK D&I task force, part of their role will be supporting industry in doing the right thing. So really important to say, to reflect your customer base, calling out things that aren't right, making them right, and helping the public see what you're doing to make things right as well. It does come back to trust, as the other panel members say. So I think being visible in terms of what you're doing, being accountable and being transparent is really important, and all will lend us in a good way to hopefully changing any negative perceptions that are out there, and reflecting our customer base will hopefully mean that we start making the right decisions, and we've got the ideas that we need to help move us on that journey towards net zero.
Thank you, Elaine. And there's a great comment that's come in from my former colleague, Catherine, that talks about the role of sort of servant leadership amongst regulators. She also highlights that when she sees photographs and imagery of all men signing things, she's just sort of ignoring it now. And I think one of the themes that has emerged is the role of men actually, making a difference, not joining the mantle, not going to all male meetings. And so I think it's there is a huge amount of role modeling that needs to be at the heart of this. We are nearly at time. It's been a fabulous conversation. Many things we've agreed on, some things where we've had some different perspectives. I'd like to just to sort of wrap up the session, and I did this on the previous session, just by asking each of our wonderful panelists just to share a final message with everybody on the call, something that they would ask that people think about doing. And let me go to Rachel first.
Well, I think really working on the inclusion part of the D&I agenda, and really thinking about our own behaviours, particularly those of us fortunate to be in leadership positions. How much are we working to make sure that the voices of everybody are heard in our organisations, not just the usual suspects, not just those with the loudest voice, and not those with the biggest pay packets. So that would be my plea, and I'm talking to myself here as much as to everybody else.
Thank you, Rachel. Let's go to Adrienne for your final comments, and then we'll let you get some sleep at nearly 3 a.m. You're on mute.
One of the things I observe in working with people is almost a sense that they're not as powerful as they are. It's not powerlessness, but I think people diminish their own power. Everybody on this call has more power than they realize, no pun intended, genuinely. I would perhaps gently challenge them to use it. And that might be the next time they opt out of a conversation, to at least notice that we've opted out and do better next time. And ideally, not. I think we all need to take more personal risk to make the world a better place, and certainly to drive the DE&I agenda. And my sense is that when we think the worst that can happen really doesn't happen, but have more of those conversations. And if that feels too big, how about a different one? Every meeting you're in that doesn't have representation, pull up an extra chair and put somebody in it who's going to learn from being there, who should be there in a few years' time. Pull up a chair. We can all do that, surely.
That first point you make is so powerful in terms of, what's the worst that can go wrong? And I genuinely believe that when we make these interventions, the person on the other end of it is just not aware of what they're doing. They haven't thought about it. It's not a deliberate attempt to undermine anything. So really great points. Elaine, we'll give you the last word today.
Gosh, no pressure, last word. I would say, look, check in on your psychological safety. I couldn't agree more with the point that was made earlier on. Is your environment comfortable and safe for people to challenge one another? So I would really thoroughly recommend that people really challenge themselves on that point. Think about your meeting setup. Think about those practices that could really be shaken up, and the good things that you can learn as a result of everything that we've been through in the last 18 months. But if you don't have the psychological safety there and the ability for people to challenge up, put ideas in, and actually see that their voice has value, then we don't benefit at all. So that would be my challenge to everybody.
Brilliant. Well, what a great way to wrap this session up. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you to our panelists, Elaine, Adrienne, Rachel. It's been a really rich conversation. Thank you for everything you've brought to the discussion today. Thank you for all the great comments that are there on the chat as well. It's really good to see those. So that brings us to a close for day one. I hope that everybody has enjoyed the wonderful discussions today. It was great to hear the Minister for Energy speak earlier on, Greg Hands. I really enjoyed hearing Lauren and Ruth discussing some of the early linkages we're making around diversity and delivering the energy transition in some work we're doing with Powerful Women and National Grid. Ruth talked about the ELC report today and shared some of the great work that was achieved in 2021 and some of the things we're hoping to achieve and setting more aspiration and ambition for 2022. Colette shared a really good conversation prior to this one. I think Colette is now in Windsor Castle receiving her OBE from the Queen, so fantastic congratulations to her. And just in terms of some of the key themes, I mean, this point around treating D&I like safety has really resonated. We heard it from Ruth, we've heard it very passionately from Duncan, from Hannah Mary, and just then from Adrienne around linking this sort of notion of psychological safety that Elaine was just talking about in terms of how we think about safety more broadly. I'm really struck also by the 50% target that Melissa mentioned. And when we think about targets of 30 or 40%, you know, the only right answer on gender has ultimately got to be 50%. So that's perhaps a conversation we will pick up in due course. So tomorrow the conference will start at 10:30. It is by invitation only. I think there are a few places left, so if you would like to join, please let the team know. There are some fantastic workshops coming up. You can see the titles there. So for those of you engaged in that, I hope you have a wonderful day. That just leaves me to thank our sponsors for making all of this happen today. So thank you for the companies. I won't list them, but we appreciate you providing the funds to make this happen. Thank you to the wonderful Powerful Women team and the team at the EI behind the scenes, making all of the technology and logistics work so seamlessly today. Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers. You've been absolutely brilliant. And finally, and most importantly, thank you to all of you for joining. I hope you've enjoyed it and looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you and have a good rest of the day.